The cold came without warning. Not the warning cold. Not the first of autumn cold that a person could still outrun with the right clothing and a good fire. This was the deep cold of a January night in the subarctic, the kind that settled into everything living and unliving alike, and claimed it all as its own. It was the kind of cold that ended people who made mistakes, and Yiska had not made a mistake in 11 months, which was the only reason he was still breathing. He moved through the black spruce trees without a sound, placing each foot exactly where he intended to place it, choosing the snow over the frozen crust where possible, keeping his body weight low and centered. His breath came in small white puffs that disappeared almost immediately in the moving air. He had been moving since before dawn. It was now late afternoon. The light was already going from the sky in the way winter light goes, quickly and without apology, leaving behind a blue-gray darkness that was its own kind of beautiful if you were the kind of person who still noticed beauty. Yiska was still that kind of person. He had decided very early in the long months of his solitude that stopping noticing beauty was one of the things that would finish him faster than cold or hunger, so he kept noticing it, even now, even here, even with the dogs sounding behind him. He heard them first as a thin, sharp thread of sound carried through the still air from the northwest. He stopped the moment he heard it, one foot lifted, the other planted, completely motionless. He listened. The sound came again. 2 dogs at minimum, working a trail with the purposeful, high-intensity quality that tracker dogs carry when they are close to what they are following. Not close in distance, not yet, but close in certainty. They had the scent locked. They were not searching. They were following. He set his foot down and changed his pace. Not running. Running was for people who did not know the terrain they were moving through, or for open ground where you could see the obstacles ahead of you. He was moving through dense spruce forest in January, with the snow uneven and full of hidden deadfall, with patches of crust that would hold his weight and patches that would not. And running through this kind of terrain was how you went down hard and fast and came up with something broken, or worse, came up too slowly. He moved at the fastest pace he could maintain with full control, reading the snow ahead of him 2 and 3 steps in advance, choosing his path as he went. He had been doing this for 11 months. He was very good at it now. The men following him were good at it too. That was the problem. He had first spotted them 18 days ago from a long ridge in the late afternoon, when the angle of the low winter sun had been exactly right to reveal the shapes moving through the valley below him. He had counted them carefully, because when you are alone in the wilderness, and you see a group of men moving in your general direction, you count them. 6. 6 men in a line, with 2 large dogs on leads and a loaded sled being pulled through the snow. Not travelers. Travelers did not move through the deep bush in January with 2 tracking dogs and 6 armed men. These were the same kind of men who had come to his people's camp 11 months ago, and he understood immediately and completely what they were doing here. He had changed his direction and increased his pace that afternoon, and they had found his trail within 2 days. Since then, he had used every technique he knew. He had walked backward along his own tracks, and then stepped sideways into a tree's snow shadow, so that his backward trail appeared to end without a turning point, which sometimes confused a human tracker long enough to gain some distance, though not long enough to lose the dogs. He had crossed 2 streams by entering the water at one point and exiting far downstream, breaking the scent trail at the water's edge, and making the dogs cast back and forth along the bank, looking for the place he had come out. He had rubbed pine resin along the soles of his moccasins to confuse the scent. He had walked the top of a long fallen log to reduce his ground contact. He had changed direction repeatedly, in patterns designed to force the dogs to reacquire his trail from scratch each time, costing time. None of it had lost them. It had slowed them, sometimes significantly, but each time they had found the trail again, and come on. Yiska thought about this as he moved, about what these men were, and where they had come from, and what their plan was. They were operating in a territory that they did not belong to, following a person through one of the most difficult environments on the continent, in the worst season of the year, with patience and methodical skill. They were not doing this for no reason. People who did this kind of thing in this kind of place were people who believed the result was worth the effort and the risk, and Yiska understood exactly what result they were after. He had seen it happen to others. He had watched it happen to the people closest to him. He understood what these men were. He crested a low rise and stopped. Below him, through the webbing of spruce branches, he could see the lake. He had known it was here. He carried a detailed internal map of this territory, built over years of travel through it, and supplemented by the stories and route descriptions that the elders of his people had given him. Landscape knowledge transmitted verbally, story by story, landmark by landmark, the way all essential knowledge was transmitted in communities that understood that knowledge is not safe unless it lives in people, not only in places. The lake was in that map. He had known it was approximately 2 days' travel to the east of the ridge where he had first spotted the men. He had been moving toward it with a growing sense that the lake was important to what happened next, though he had not yet known exactly why. Now, standing on the rise and looking down at the ice-covered surface spreading out before him, he began to understand. The lake was large, nearly half a mile across at its widest point, running east to west, with the high ground where he stood to the north, and a gentler wooded slope to the south. The snow on its surface was clean, and even where the wind had smoothed it, with pressure ridges showing in a few places where the ice had buckled and lifted as it expanded through the winter. In the last of the afternoon light, the lake looked absolutely solid. It looked like something you could run across. It looked like the most direct, fastest route forward. And that appearance was a lie. Yiska stood very still on the rise, and let the memory come up from wherever it had been stored in the back of his mind, where all the important things lived, waiting to be needed. His grandfather had taken him to a lake exactly like this one, perhaps this one, he was not certain, when Yiska was 8 or 9 years old, and had crouched beside him on the bank and spoken to him in the quiet, careful tone that meant what he was saying was important and should be remembered. His grandfather had talked about the underground springs that fed the lake from below, running through the ground in channels that had been there long before any living person's memory, channels that kept the water in certain parts of the lake moving very slightly, even in the deepest cold of winter. The thing about moving water is that it does not freeze the same way that still water does. Still water in January, at these temperatures, builds ice a foot thick or more near the surface, reliable and strong. Moving water, even moving slowly, resists freezing. The ice above a spring-fed section of water looks like all other ice from above. It has the same color, the same snow cover, but it is thin. It can be 2 inches thick where the surrounding ice is 14. A wolf could cross it with its weight distributed on 4 feet and still go through. A man had no chance. His grandfather had shown him the signs. The slight color difference in the snow over the thin ice, where warmth rising from below had melted the snow's underside and changed its texture. The faint darkening in the ice itself, where it was thin enough to let some of the water color through. The places where the snow was missing or very sparse, because the warmth below had been slowly consuming it from underneath all winter. His grandfather had drawn a rough map in the snow of where the springs ran under that lake, a diagonal line from the northwest section of the center toward the southeast, crossing the natural crossing point that someone traveling east from the north bank would take. A person who did not know that map would walk out onto that lake with confidence. They would reach the center, and they would go through. Yiska stood on the rise and looked at the lake, and an idea arrived in his mind with a sudden clarity that was almost physical, like stepping into cold water. He did not reach for it or construct it. It was simply there, complete and clear, the way the right answer to a real problem arrives when the problem is urgent enough and the mind is focused enough. He needed materials. He needed time. He needed the men and their dogs to still be far enough behind him to give him that time. He listened. The dogs were calling. Still far enough. He moved down the slope toward the lake. At the edge of the tree line, he began searching the ground, moving quickly, turning over snow-covered deadfall with his foot, checking the bases of trees. He needed hardwood, dry and solid. He found a section of dead birch within 5 minutes, gray and sound, about as long as his forearm, and nearly as thick. He pulled it free from where it lay half buried in the snow, and tested its weight and density by pressing his thumbnail into it. Solid. Good. He searched further, and found what he needed next, in 2 sections of curved spruce root, which took effort to free from the frozen ground, and left his hands aching from the work of prying and wrenching them out. He had a strip of leather in his pack that he used for repairs, and his knife was always accessible. He crouched at the base of a spruce tree and began to work. He had spent years watching wolves move across terrain. Wolves were the most efficient travelers in this landscape, and a person who paid attention to efficiency paid attention to wolves. He knew the shape of a wolf's paw print from dozens of angles and in dozens of snow conditions. He knew the oval shape of the central pad, the 4 toe impressions arranged around it, the slight differences in depth between the heel of the print and the toes, the way a walking wolf's weight rolled from heel to toe, and how that created a specific pattern in the compressed snow. He knew the spacing between prints, which changed with gait, and he knew how the rear foot of a walking wolf lands just slightly behind the front foot's track, creating a paired pattern with a specific measurement between the pairs. This knowledge had been background knowledge until now. It was the kind of thing he knew the way. He knew many things. Thoroughly. Automatically. Without having to think about it. The way a person who has been attentive to the world around them accumulates knowledge without particularly meaning to. It had never before needed to be useful in this specific way. He carved the wood with focused, rapid strokes of his knife, checking the shape against his memory repeatedly. He pressed the emerging form into the snow beside him several times as he worked, studying the impression, adjusting the shape. The spruce root pieces he bent and bound to the wood with the leather strip in a way that would add a subtle arch to the impression, reproducing the cupped shape of a paw that was bearing weight in movement. He worked for 20 minutes, maybe 25. The cold was working on his fingers despite the rabbit skin wrappings, making the knife strokes slightly less precise than he wanted them to be. He pressed the finished stamp into the snow beside him and studied the result. It was a wolf print. Not perfect. A truly expert wolf track reader, someone who spent every day of their professional life studying such things, might notice something off about the ratio of the central pad to the toe impressions, or the slight stiffness in the pattern that resulted from a wooden tool rather than an organic paw. But someone following a human trail through a winter wilderness, someone tired from days of travel, someone moving with the momentum of pursuit rather than the careful attention of dedicated study, that person would see a wolf print, and a wolf print at the right moment means one thing. It means the ice is safe. Yiska stood up, put the stamp in his pack, and looked out at the lake. The afternoon light was nearly gone. The sky was darkening in the east and still faintly orange in the west behind him, and in between the lake lay pale and flat and waiting. He was about to go out onto ice that he knew was dangerous in the center. He was going to do this deliberately, by choice, in fading light, with men and dogs perhaps 30 minutes behind him. He was going to walk back and forth across this ice, pressing false wolf tracks into the snow, attempting to create a convincing deception that would lead those men out onto the thin section. If he was wrong about the ice, he would go through. If he made errors in the tracks that an experienced tracker recognized, the deception would fail and the men would come around the shore after him. If the thin section was not where he remembered it being, or was not as thin as his grandfather had said, everything failed. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the specific, detailed care with which the old man had described the springs and the ice, and the signs to read. He thought about the fact that his grandfather had not been guessing or approximating. He had been passing on knowledge that had been tested and verified, knowledge that had cost someone something in its acquisition, knowledge that was given freely and completely, because it was the kind of knowledge that kept people alive. He trusted his grandfather. He had always trusted his grandfather. He stepped out onto the ice. The lake groaned softly beneath him, the low sound of ice accepting weight and adjusting to it. He knew that sound. He had heard it on every frozen lake he had ever crossed. It was not the sound of failure. It was the sound of function. He moved away from the bank slowly, testing each step, listening through the soles of his feet for the quality of the ice below, reading the information available through pressure and sound, and the subtle flex of the surface under his weight. The near-shore ice was thick and reliable. He could feel it. He moved in a careful arc, staying within the safe zone, beginning to press the wooden stamp into the snow as he went, creating the first wolf prints at the near bank end of what would be the false trail. He worked backward. This was essential. The false trail had to appear as though the wolf had come from the far bank toward the near bank, meaning the man following it would walk out from the near bank toward the center, in the same direction the wolf appeared to have come from. He moved steadily, pressing each print with care, checking the spacing and depth, adding the natural variations that would make the trail read as authentic, a slight speed increase where the prints spread a little farther apart, a pause where they clustered slightly before resuming their steady rhythm. He worked toward the center of the lake, and as he worked he was simultaneously navigating the safe ice, staying on the reliable section, feeling for the moment when the character of the ice began to change. He felt it as a subtle shift in resonance, rather than in physical sensation. a difference in the way the ice communicated load distribution beneath him. He stopped and crouched. He pressed his bare palm flat against the snow surface, pushing the snow away until he could feel the ice directly, and held his hand there. The temperature was different, infinitesimally, but present, warmth rising from below through thinner ice, reaching the surface in a way that thick ice did not permit. He was at the edge of the thin zone. He pressed his ear to the ice surface and listened. Below, very faintly, the water was moving. The sound of moving water under ice has a specific quality that is nothing like the sound of still water under ice, and the difference was clear to him as he lay there. He rose carefully and looked at the surface. The signs his grandfather had described were exactly here. Slightly thinner snow, the crystal structure different from the surrounding snow, altered by the subliminal warmth below. He traced the extent of the thin zone with his eyes, moving in a slow arc around it, staying on the solid edges. Then he began pressing the false wolf tracks through the center of it. He moved with concentrated precision, placing each stamp exactly where he wanted it, centering the track route in the thinnest part of the thin zone. He pressed each print firmly enough to be convincing, but not so hard that the impression was implausibly deep. He added a detail that gave him particular satisfaction, a set of prints where the wolf appeared to have stopped briefly in the middle of the crossing, the prints clustering slightly together, as though the animal had paused, before continuing on. An animal that paused in the middle of crossing, and then continued, was an animal that had found nothing to worry about. An experienced tracker would read that pause not as hesitation, but as confidence. He completed the crossing of the thin zone and continued to the far bank, pressing the trail all the way. At the far bank he brushed the stamp clean, turned, and looked back across the lake at the work he had made. In the fading light, the wolf trail was visible and clear, a purposeful line of prints crossing from south bank to north bank. The trail was confident, unhesitating, the track of an animal that knew exactly where it was and had no reason for caution. It went directly over the place where the ice would not hold a man's weight. He spent the next 20 minutes erasing signs of his own presence on the ice, using a spruce branch to brush the snow around the edges of his own path, smoothing the disturbances he had made while working. He could not erase everything, but he could make his presence much harder to detect for a person whose attention was on the clear wolf trail ahead of them. He backed into the far tree line and began moving along the shore, circling north and west through the forest to reach the high ground above the north bank. He found his position between two rocks with a clear view of the near shore and the lake. He settled in, tucked the spruce bark around his legs, and told himself to be still. The dogs' voices were very close now, less than half an hour. He breathed slowly. He focused on the tree line below him. He waited. The stars came out one by one, sharp and dense in the cold, clear sky. The lake was pale and still in the starlight. Everything was very quiet, except for the dogs, which were quieter now too, the way dogs get when they are very close to what they are following. The first torch appeared in the tree line. Yiska went completely still. 6 shapes came down to the shore, the dogs out front, the torches making small moving circles of orange light. The lead tracker crouched immediately at the near shore, studying the ground with the torch held low. He moved a few steps onto the ice and crouched again, holding the light over the wolf trail, following it with his eyes out across the lake. Another man said something. The tracker replied without looking up from the tracks. One of the dogs strained hard toward the wolf trail, then pulled back, confused. The scent was complicated here. Real wolf from 2 days ago, Yiska's disguised passage, the pine resin, the spruce brush. The dogs circled without settling. The tracker stood. He pointed across the lake. He stepped forward onto the ice, and the others followed. Yiska watched from the ridge, his breath very slow, his body completely still between the rocks. He watched the 6 torches move out from the near bank in a loose group, spreading slightly as men do on open ground. He watched them reach 20 meters, 30, 40. Then he heard the sound. Not a roar. Not the dramatic sound you might imagine if you were imagining it rather than hearing it. It was a flat, hard crack that expanded outward from a single point, like a word spoken too sharply, followed immediately by a lower, spreading sound, a fracturing sound, and then sounds he did not want to describe even in his own mind. The torches moved in sudden lurching directions. Shouts carried across the ice. For a few seconds the sounds were loud and confused, and then they diminished, and then there were 2 torches moving back toward the near shore, moving fast, and then they were at the shore, and then they were in the tree line. 2. Only 2. Yiska lay between the rocks and did not move for a very long time. The lake was dark and quiet. The stars had not changed. The cold pressed down on everything, exactly as it had before. Nothing in the world had paused. Nothing had noted what happened here tonight, in any way, except the memory of the man lying between 2 rocks on a ridge above the north bank. A man who was cold and tired and alone and alive, and who would carry this night with him for the rest of his life, not as a triumph, not as anything he had wanted, but as the night he used everything he had ever been taught, and it had been exactly enough. He waited until he was certain. Then he rose slowly from between the rocks, shook the life back into his legs, and turned east. The morning was still hours away. He started walking. He did not stop moving until the sky had gone from black to a deep pre-dawn gray, and the stars were fading at the edges of the sky in the east. He had been walking for hours. His legs were not complaining yet, in the way that legs eventually begin to complain, which told him that the adrenaline was still doing its work, still running warm through his system, keeping the exhaustion at a remove. He knew from experience that the exhaustion would come later, and when it came, it would come all at once, like a creditor who has been patient for too long, and is now no longer patient at all. He found a hollow, where a large spruce had fallen between 2 younger trees, creating a natural angled shelter on the leeward side. He checked it carefully before committing to it, looking for signs that any animal had used it recently, checking the snow around the entrance, reading the information available in the undisturbed surface. Nothing. He climbed in, pulled his pack in behind him, and broke several green spruce branches to lay across the opening, to block the draft and reduce the visible entrance. Then he put his back against the trunk of the fallen tree, which was still holding some of the thermal memory of its living years, and he thought. His grandfather had been a man of particular habits, one of which was to always review, after any difficult event, not just what had happened, but what had been learned from it. This was not sentimentality. This was methodology. The wilderness was a teacher, his grandfather had said, but only to those students who were willing to sit with the lesson after class. You did not learn from difficulty by surviving it. You learned from it by afterward asking what it had shown you that you had not known before, or what it had confirmed that you had suspected, or what it had challenged that you had believed. Yiska sat in the spruce hollow and reviewed. He had been tracked for 18 days by 6 men and 2 dogs, covering a territory of perhaps 40 miles, through terrain that he knew well, and they presumably did not. He had used every evasion technique available to him, and they had found him again each time. What did that tell him? It told him that these men were exceptionally good at what they were doing. It told him that the dogs were well trained and experienced. It told him that the techniques that worked against ordinary trackers were not sufficient against these particular men. He had needed something that was not a technique. He had needed to change the situation itself. That was what the lake had been, not a technique, a change of situation. He had moved the contest from terrain he and they shared access to, terrain where his advantages of local knowledge were real, but not decisive, into a specific place, where he had information they did not have, and where that asymmetry was absolute. On open ground in the forest, 6 experienced men with dogs had every advantage over 1 man alone. But in the specific geography of that lake's thin center, the specific piece of knowledge his grandfather had given him was worth more than all their experience and equipment combined. He thought about that for a while. He thought about what it meant for the rest of his journey east. He was still far from the trading community he was trying to reach. There was a long way still to go. The 2 men who had survived the lake would eventually report back to whoever had sent them, and there would be decisions made about what to do next. He did not know what those decisions would be, or when they would lead to consequences for him. He could not plan for every possibility. What he could do was move and stay alive, and reach safety before the next problem found him. He slept. He slept hard and deep for 6 hours, which he knew, because when he woke the sun was well up in the low winter sky, and the light in the hollow was brighter than when he had closed his eyes. He lay still for a moment after waking, which was a habit he had built in the months of being alone, the habit of re-entering consciousness carefully, rather than abruptly, taking a few seconds to listen to the environment around him before moving, assessing what the sounds told him about what was in the area. He heard a red squirrel chattering somewhere overhead, which was excellent information. Squirrels went silent when predators were near, both animal and human predators. The squirrel was talking freely. He was alone. He ate a small portion of his remaining food, a strip of dried meat that he chewed slowly, making it last, and drank water from a small depression in the bark of a fallen log where overnight melting had collected a thin pool. Then he checked his feet, because feet were the most critical component of any long wilderness journey, the parts that determined whether everything else could continue. His right foot was fine. His left foot had 2 toes that were concerning, not frostbitten, not damaged, but cold-bitten enough to need attention. He rubbed them carefully with his hands until the blood was moving freely again and the color had returned, and then he put on his spare foot, wrapping over the existing one for the extra insulation. He checked his remaining supplies with the kind of accurate attention that is only possible when you have had a great deal of practice thinking clearly about uncomfortable realities. He had food for approximately 3 days, if he was careful. He had his fire-starting materials and the knowledge to use them, but making fires carried risks of smoke visibility, and he had to weigh that against warmth and cooking needs each time the question arose. He had his knife, his pack, the wooden stamp, and everything he was wearing, which was good cold-weather clothing, but not as good as it had been 11 months ago when it was new. He needed to move east. That was the simple, clear answer to all the calculations. Move east, find the trading community. Get inside, get warm, get fed. Everything else was secondary to that. He pulled the spruce branches from the entrance to his shelter and crawled out into the winter morning. The day was clear and cold, the sky a pure pale blue overhead with no cloud anywhere, which was beautiful, but also meant the temperature was at its most extreme, because cloud cover worked like a blanket, and clear skies let the cold go all the way to the top of the sky and come back down with nothing in the way. He could see a long distance from the ridge he climbed to get his bearings, a view of forested valleys and distant ridgelines stretching east in waves of blue, gray, and white. Somewhere in that direction, 12 or more days of walking away, there was a flat-topped hill that his grandfather had described, and below that hill, people. He oriented himself and began to walk. The forest in this section of his route was primarily spruce, mixed with occasional stands of birch and poplar, where the terrain opened slightly onto south-facing slopes. These open sections were warmer in the brief window of afternoon sunlight, and he moved through them more quickly than through the dense spruce, where the shade kept the snow deep and soft, and his legs had to work harder against the resistance. He had learned long ago to match his pace to the terrain, rather than to maintain a constant speed regardless of conditions. Constant speed in variable terrain was an amateur's mistake, one that burned energy disproportionately and delivered less actual progress than the intelligent modulation of effort. He thought about food as he walked, because food was now a primary concern. The dried meat and the pressed fat he carried were not going to last 3 days at the rate he needed to consume calories to sustain this pace in this cold. He needed to supplement. He needed to hunt or trap, which meant either slowing down to hunt properly or setting snares at rest stops and back-checking them, which cost time, but less time than active hunting. He set a snare that afternoon, in a run he found under a brush pile at the edge of an open slope, a rabbit run, clearly and regularly used, the packed snow of the path showing regular use. He made the snare from wire he carried in his pack for exactly this purpose, and hung it correctly, at the right height from the run, adjusted for the size of the animal he was targeting. He marked the location carefully in his mind and kept walking. He set 2 more snares before dark, both in promising locations, both set with the care and precision that came from years of practice. Snare setting was an art that looked simple and was not. Everything mattered: the height, the angle, the trigger mechanism, the clearance on both sides, the absence of the setter's scent as much as possible. He had improved considerably at all of it over the past year, because snares had been the difference between eating and not eating on many days, and the difference between eating and not eating in this kind of cold was not subtle. He camped that night under a dense spruce whose lowest branches swept the ground, creating a natural shelter space. He did not make a fire. He ate a little of his remaining dried food, bundled himself carefully, and slept. On the second morning he checked his snares. The first 2 were empty. The third held a snowshoe hare, and he stood for a moment looking at it with the particular mix of feelings that comes with finding an animal in a snare: relief at the food, a brief acknowledgement of the animal, and then the practical shift into what needed to happen next. He had learned not to linger in any of those feelings past their useful length. He made a fire in a protected spot, small and efficient, using dry wood that burned with minimal smoke. He cooked the hare completely and ate most of it, saving a portion for the next day. He felt the difference in his body within the hour, food converting to energy in ways that were almost tactile, the heaviness in his legs lifting slightly, the cold retreating a fraction. He sat by the small fire for a few minutes after eating, which he allowed himself as a brief luxury before covering the fire site with snow and moving on. The days after the first two were characterized by a rhythm that he had lived in long enough to have a complex relationship with, the rhythm of sustained wilderness travel in winter. It was not a romantic rhythm. It was not the kind of thing that was enjoyable in any straightforward sense. It was demanding and monotonous and frequently uncomfortable, with occasional moments of genuine beauty that arrived unexpectedly and then passed. He had learned to find a kind of satisfaction in it that was different from enjoyment, but not less real. The satisfaction of competence, the satisfaction of reading the terrain correctly and moving through it well, the satisfaction of solving small problems continuously, all day, and solving them correctly. He thought about his people as he walked. This was something he had not allowed himself to do very much in the months of immediate survival, because thinking about his people cost him something. Cost him the kind of energy that a person can least afford, when every calorie is also needed for physical function. But now, with the immediate crisis behind him, and the forward direction clear, the thoughts came whether he invited them or not. He thought about specific people. He thought about his grandfather, who had been gone for 4 years before any of this happened, who had died in the way old people sometimes do in that country, quietly and in winter, sitting by a fire. He thought about his mother, who had known the route to the Eastern trading community well enough to describe it to him in detail, who had gone twice as a child with her own parents. He thought about the particular sound of the languages of his people, when several people were talking at once, the way conversations overlapped and wove together. He did not think about the spring. He kept the door on the spring firmly shut. He would open it when he had the space and safety to sit with what was inside it. That time had not yet come. What he thought about instead, when he needed to think about something that was not terrain or food or weather, was the wooden stamp in his pack. He took it out once and held it as he walked, turning it in his hands, looking at the shape he had carved in the dark and the cold. It was a crude thing by daylight. He could see its limitations clearly now, the places where the carving was imprecise, the angle of the spruce root bindings that was slightly off from what he had intended. And yet it had worked. The false trail it had made had been convincing enough. The men who had followed it had not hesitated. He thought about why. He thought about the gap between what the stamp was, a rough wooden tool made in 20 minutes by cold hands, and what it had been read as, which was evidence of a living wolf crossing a frozen lake with complete confidence. The gap between the object and the reading of it was filled by the tracker's expectations. The tracker had expected wolf tracks because wolves crossed frozen lakes sometimes. He had expected the ice to be solid because the wolf appeared to have crossed it safely. He had expected to see what his experience of the world told him was likely, and his experience was the standard experience of an outsider in this territory, the experience of a person who knew tracking in general, but did not know this specific lake and what was underneath it. Local knowledge had defeated general experience. Specific, detailed, place-bound knowledge had defeated the accumulated expertise of a skilled and determined man. Not because one was smarter than the other, but because they had been operating in a space where one kind of knowledge was decisive and the other was irrelevant. He put the stamp back in his pack. He crossed a small stream on the 4th day, a straightforward crossing on ice that he tested thoroughly before trusting it, making it in good order without any drama. He saw fresh moose tracks on the far bank, heading south. He did not follow them. A moose was more meat than he could use or carry, and he did not have the time or equipment for a proper moose hunt. He noted the tracks, filed the information, kept walking. On the 5th day, the weather changed. He had been watching the sky to the north for 2 days, reading the gradual change in the clouds, the way the wind had shifted, the subtle drop in temperature that preceded incoming weather. He had built a very good shelter the evening before, knowing the storm was coming, and he was inside it and well covered when the first serious snow began in the early morning hours. He was not pleased about the storm. A storm was delay. Delay was exposure time. Exposure time was risk. He lay in his shelter and listened to the wind working over the trees, bending the tops of the spruces, filling in the tracks he had made in the days before with fresh, clean snow. He thought about the 2 men from the lake, They were somewhere to the west of him, moving slowly back toward wherever they had come from, without their sled, without their equipment, with only 2 of them instead of 6. He did not know what condition they were in. He did not wish them harm beyond what had already happened. He simply wanted to stay far enough ahead of whatever they reported, and whoever received that report, that he could reach safety before the consequences caught up with him. The storm lasted 22 hours. He was careful, and still throughout, burning very little energy, eating a small amount at intervals, keeping himself from both sleep and restlessness by going through the route to the eastern community in his mind, reviewing each landmark his mother and grandfather had described in the order they had described them. The flat-topped hill, the river with the island, the rocky outcropping on the south face of the ridge, the open bog with the single tall dead pine in the center. He walked the route in his mind, step by step, landmark by landmark, rebuilding it until he could walk it backward as easily as forward. When the storm ended, he waited 2 more hours, until he was sure it was finished, and not merely pausing, then emerged into a forest that looked new. Deep, clean snow on every surface. The branches bowed under it. The tracks he had made before the storm were completely gone, replaced by a surface that looked as though no one had passed through in weeks. In one sense, this was a benefit. Any pursuit that had been following him from the west would find no trail here. He oriented himself from the stars, which were out again now, in the clear post-storm sky, and began walking east. He was moving well. He was alive. He had survived things in the past months that would have finished most people. He did not think about this with pride, because pride was not a useful thing in his current situation, but he did think about it factually, as information about his own capabilities, because knowing what you are capable of is essential to planning. He was capable of considerable things. He had demonstrated that. He intended to keep demonstrating it until he reached the flat-topped hill and the people below it. The stars moved over his head as he walked. The cold was serious but not killing. The forest was quiet and deep and dark, and somewhere ahead of him, the distance was shrinking. He kept walking. On the morning of the 7th day, he made a discovery that stopped him in his tracks. He had been moving through a section of dense spruce forest, following the line of a frozen creek bed that ran roughly east, when he saw the tracks. Wolf tracks, real ones, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp, and the snow had not yet begun to sublimate and round the impressions. A pack. He counted the sets, 4 animals, moving northwest to southeast, crossing his path at an angle. He crouched beside the tracks and studied them for a long moment. Real wolves. He had been thinking about wolves for days, thinking about what he knew of them, how he had used his knowledge of their gait and paw shape and stride pattern in the dark at the lake. And here were the actual animals, walking through the same forest, going about their lives with complete indifference to everything that had happened at the lake, to the cold and the storm, and the 6 men, and the thin ice. They were simply wolves, doing what wolves do, moving through their territory, hunting, living. He felt something settle in him at the sight of those tracks. He could not explain it precisely. It was something like the comfort of the world continuing. The wolves did not know about him or the lake or any of it. The forest did not know. The cold did not know. Everything simply continued, and its continuance was a form of permission, a reminder that the world was larger than any one event in it, and would go on being larger. He stood up and continued east. The 7th day brought him to the first river crossing, which he had been anticipating and thinking about for 2 days. His mother had mentioned it in her description of the route. A river, she had said, that ran wider and faster than it looked in winter, with banks that were treacherous because the current ran close to the surface ice near the shore, and the ice was thin there, even when it looked thick. She had told him to go upstream from the obvious crossing point, to find where the river bent, because at the inside of a bend the current slowed and the ice was thicker and more reliable. He had remembered this detail. He had kept it with the other route details in his mind. Now he walked upstream along the bank, looking for the bend, and found it after perhaps half a mile. At the inside of the bend, the river's surface was smoother, and the ice had a different quality, denser and more opaque, the sign of ice that had built slowly over still water rather than moving water. He tested it at the bank and found it strong. He moved out carefully, distributing his weight, listening, crossing in the way he had been taught, with full attention, no rushing, reading the ice continuously. He made the crossing without incident. On the far bank, He felt the particular satisfaction of a task completed that had been planned and anticipated and executed correctly. Small satisfactions mattered enormously in a life that was largely made of difficulty. He made himself notice them. 12 days of walking. Longer than he had hoped when he started, but the storm had cost him 2 days, and the river detour had cost him half of one, and the terrain in this section was more demanding than he had expected, with a ridge system running northeast to southwest that forced him either to cross the ridges, which was exhausting in deep snow, or to detour around them, which added distance. He detoured most of the time and crossed when the crossing was worth the energy cost. He was lean now in a way that went beyond ordinary thinness. He could feel it in the way his clothing hung on him, in the extra room at his waist and chest. His body had used everything it did not absolutely need. What remained was stripped down to function, a body that was doing exactly what it needed to do and nothing more. He thought, as he moved, that this was perhaps what the whole year had been, a long process of stripping down to what was essential. The things he had carried at the beginning of the year, not physical things but the other kind, assumptions and habits and expectations, had been taken off him one by the events of the year, not gently, not at his invitation, but by the simple force of reality, meeting a life and removing from it what reality did not support. What was left was this: a man walking east, knowledge in his hands and his mind and his memory, a direction, a destination. He kept walking. The morning Yiska first understood that he was going to survive, not just the immediate situation, not just the next day, but actually going to reach something that could be called safety, was the morning he saw the flat-topped hill. It appeared to the east as he came over a ridge, just as his mother had described it, just as his grandfather had mentioned it in passing once years ago, and the recognition he felt was not just geographical. It was something larger than geography. It was the recognition of being in a place he had always known was ahead of him, a place that existed first as story, and was now becoming fact. The hill's top was unmistakably flat, a long dark line against the pale sky, the timber on its eastern face exactly as his mother had described it, the slope running south at the angle she had traced with her finger in the dirt of their camp floor years ago, drawing it for him, saying, "When you see this hill, you are close." He stopped on the ridge and looked at the hill for a long time. He was 11 days into the journey east, which meant he was close to the limit of what his body could sustain on the food remaining to him. He had found another hare 3 days ago, and eaten all of it the same day, and since then, had had only small amounts of the dried food, and some frozen berries he had found on a bush under the snow. Barely enough to keep moving, but enough. He had been moving on the thin line between functioning and not functioning for 2 days, and the sight of the flat-topped hill was therefore not just emotional but urgently practical. Close meant perhaps one more day. One more day he could manage. He came down off the ridge and into the valley below the hill, moving through forest that was different in character from what he had been in for the past week. Slightly warmer, more mixed. Birch and poplar mixed into the spruce, the south-facing slopes showing the subtle difference in light that came from a slightly lower latitude. He was not used to these trees. The details were slightly off from the forest of his home territory. Small differences in the shape of the bark, the arrangement of the branches, the species of birds he heard. He was, for the first time in a year, in country that was genuinely not his. Everything he had survived up until now had happened in territory he knew. This was the edge of something else. He found the boy just before dark. He came around a bend in a small creek, and there was a child standing at the edge of a clearing, holding a bundle of firewood that was almost too large for him to carry comfortably. The boy was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, dressed in good winter clothing, clearly not distressed or lost, clearly a child from somewhere nearby going about ordinary business. He looked at Yiska with the still, careful expression of a child who has been taught to be thoughtful about strangers, who is assessing before reacting. Yiska stopped several steps away. He kept his hands visible and away from his pack. He did not move suddenly. The boy studied him for what felt like a very long moment. Then he said something in a language that was not Yiska's language but was clearly related to it, the kind of relatedness that comes from two languages that were once closer than they are now, but still share enough vocabulary and enough grammatical bones that careful listening can bridge them. The boy said something that meant, roughly, that Yiska was not from near here. Yiska said, in his own language, choosing simple words and speaking slowly, "You are right. I have been traveling for a long time. I am looking for the people who live near the hill with the flat top. The boy tilted his head and looked at Yiska a moment longer, with the evaluative expression of someone who is making a decision. Then he shifted the bundle of firewood to a better grip and tilted his head toward the forest behind him. Yiska followed him. The camp was 12 minutes' walk through the trees. It was a winter camp of perhaps 40 to 50 people, well established, the kind of camp that had been in the same location for many winters, the paths between structures packed down by long use, the wood supply enormous and well organized, the structures solid and well insulated against the cold. Yiska took all this in as the boy led him in, because he had learned in the past year to read environments quickly and completely, to know within the first few seconds of entering a place what kind of place it was, whether it was safe, whether it was what it appeared to be. This was a good place. It was organized and purposeful, and clearly the home of people who knew what they were doing in this climate and this country. The smell of cooking reached him from the nearest structure, and the smell was almost overwhelming after so many days of cold and raw food. He made himself stay calm and follow the boy without rushing. A woman came out of the nearest structure before they reached it. She was older, perhaps 60, with the particular quality of attention of someone who has been managing difficult situations for a long time, and is therefore not alarmed by them, but is entirely aware. She looked at Yiska the way the boy had looked at him, that same careful, unhurried assessment, and Yiska let her look, holding still, and allowing his appearance to tell whatever story it told, because his appearance after 11 months and 12 days of walking was honest information. He looked like what he was. She spoke to him in her language, slowly and clearly, and he understood perhaps 70% of it. She was asking him where he came from and whether he was alone. He said yes, he was alone. He said he had come from the west, from the territory near the big river that ran north to the coast, where his people's camp had been. He used the past tense. He said the past tense clearly, because it was important to be accurate about what no longer existed. She understood what he had not said, as much as what he had said. She brought him inside. The warmth inside the structure was the most complicated physical experience Yiska had had in many months. He had been cold for so long that warmth had stopped being a normal state and had become instead something he thought about abstractly, something he remembered rather than experienced. The actual experience of it, now, sitting near the fire with his outer layer being taken from him by the woman's firm hands, was almost too much. He felt it in his chest before he felt it on his skin. Something loosened. Something that had been clenched hard for 11 months, not through any decision on his part but simply as a response to the sustained nature of what those months had required, loosened by degrees, like a fist slowly opening. He did not cry. He had cried once in the early months, one night in September when the cold had first arrived in earnest, and he had been caught without adequate shelter, and he was very afraid and very alone, and he had allowed himself that night to feel the full extent of what had happened to him, and it had come out as weeping, silent and long, and when it was finished he had felt emptied in a useful way, lighter, able to continue. He had not cried since. He had stored things instead, in the room in the back of his mind, behind the closed door. Now, sitting by the fire, he felt the door straining. He breathed carefully and held it. Food came. He ate slowly, which took discipline but was necessary. He had learned about eating after deprivation in the hard way, in the months of this year, when he had sometimes eaten too fast after a few days without, and spent the following hours wishing he had not. He ate slowly and paid attention to each bite, and felt his body beginning to respond, the deep biological satisfaction of sustained hunger being addressed, the return of something that resembled steadiness. People moved around him. No one demanded anything of him. The woman spoke to others in the camp, and the information was passed that a traveler had arrived, clearly a person who had been through something difficult, and was not yet ready for questions. This was how people who understood hardship handled the arrival of someone from hardship. They did not demand an accounting before the person had been fed and warmed. The accounting could wait, the person could not. He slept that night on proper bedding, not on the forest floor, not on spruce boughs, not on cold ground. The bedding was thick and warm, and the structure held the fire's warmth efficiently, and Yiska lay down and closed his eyes, and was unconscious almost immediately, without the usual period of alertness where his mind scanned the environment and ran the night's calculations. He simply went to sleep, like a person who is safe and knows it. He slept for 9 hours, which he had not done since before the previous spring. He woke slowly, carefully, coming up through layers of sleep the way a person comes up through water, gradually lightening, becoming aware of the sounds around him before he opened his eyes. The fire, other people breathing, sounds of activity from outside, quiet morning sounds of a camp going about its business. He lay still for a moment and let all of this confirm itself. Then he opened his eyes. The old man was sitting nearby, not close, not intrusively close, but at the comfortable distance of someone who wants to be available when you are ready, not before. He was perhaps 70 years old, with the lined, settled face of someone who has lived long enough to have a complex relationship with almost everything. He looked at Yiska with the same careful openness the woman had shown the night before, waiting. Yiska sat up slowly. His body was stiff in ways that told him everything he already knew about the past year. He straightened gradually, easing each part of himself into position. The old man offered him something to drink, a broth that had been warming near the fire, and Yiska accepted it and drank it carefully, feeling it go down and spread warmth through the center of him. The old man did not speak immediately. He waited while Yiska drank, and when Yiska set the cup down and looked at him, he simply said, "Take your time." It was in his own language, not Yiska's language but close enough, and in those 3 words, the gap between the languages was narrow enough to be certain of the meaning. Take your time. Yiska thought about where to begin. There was so much of it, the event of the previous spring, the 11 months, the men, the lake, the 12 days. It was a large account, and he was still tired, and parts of it were not yet ready to be told, which the old man's unhurried manner seemed to understand without being told. He began with the most recent part. He told it in the order in which it had happened, from the day 18 days ago when he had spotted the men from the ridge, through the days of being followed, to the lake and what he had done there, to the 12 days walking east, through weather and cold, and the second river crossing, and the storm, and finally the flat-topped hill, and the boy in the clearing, with his armload of wood. The old man listened. He was the kind of listener who was completely still and completely present, who did not fill silences with acknowledgments, or shift his position to indicate he was following. He just listened, and his listening was a kind of encouragement to continue, because it created a space that wanted to be filled by the story. When Yiska reached the part about the lake, about the wooden stamp and the false wolf tracks, the old man's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly in a way that Yiska noticed. A kind of attention that had already been full becoming somehow fuller. When Yiska finished describing what had happened when the men reached the center of the lake, the old man was quiet for what felt like a long time. He said, "Which lake was this?" He described the direction and the general location, and the old man nodded slowly. He said, "My grandfather knew that lake." He said it the way a person says a fact that is not new but has just become relevant. He said that his grandfather had traded with Yiska's people when their grandfathers were young men together, and that during those trading visits he had been shown the lake and warned about the center. He said the knowledge had been passed down in his community the same way, through stories, from grandfather to grandson, and that it was still in the community's memory, that people here knew to be careful in the center of that lake. Yiska sat with this for a moment. 2 communities, 2 different languages, 2 chains of grandfathers and grandchildren, the same lake, the same warning, the same knowledge, kept alive in 2 different places over 2 generations, waiting. He had used knowledge that was also their knowledge. The lake's secret was not one family's secret. It was something that had been shared, once, between communities that traded and traveled between each other's territories, and that sharing had survived in both places. He had known his half of it. They had known their half. Neither half, alone, would have mattered much to anyone, but his half, in the specific circumstances of that specific night, had been everything. He told the old man this. The old man considered it. Then he said something that Yiska thought about for a long time after. He said, "Knowledge passed between people is like a bridge. You never know when someone will need to cross it." Yiska thought about his grandfather building that bridge. He thought about the man on the other side, the old man's grandfather, accepting the knowledge and building the bridge in his own community. He thought about how neither of them had known what the bridge would eventually carry, or who would use it, or when. He said, "My grandfather would have been glad to know that. He would have thought that was the right way to talk about it." The old man said, "Perhaps he does know it. Perhaps these things find their way back to people." Yiska did not know what he believed about that. He had spent a year with the question of what he believed, and the year had not resolved it. He had come to think that perhaps some questions were not meant to be resolved, that their value was in the holding of them, in keeping them open and alive, rather than closing them with an answer that might be too small for the question. He said, "Perhaps they do." They sat together in a comfortable silence after that, which was the kind of silence that only exists between people who do not need to fill it, and outside the structure the camp continued its mourning, and the fire continued doing what fires do, and the cold continued on the other side of the walls, and Yiska was inside. He stayed in the camp through the rest of that day and the next, recovering. He was not passive in the recovery. He helped with the tasks that needed doing, the cutting and stacking of firewood, the repairing of a section of one structure's outer wall where the cold had worked its way through a gap, the daily work of a winter camp that never fully stopped. He helped because he could not sit still without purpose, and because offering his hands was also a way of offering himself, of saying that he intended to be useful rather than simply a recipient. The woman who had brought him in, whose name he learned was Dorothy, was the person who set him to work. She did not ask whether he was rested enough or whether he felt up to it. She simply showed him what needed doing, which was a form of respect, the assumption that he was capable and would rather be occupied than idle. He worked alongside whoever was nearby and paid attention to how things were done here, how the community organized its effort, how decisions about work were made. Every community had its own way of doing these things, its own habits and structures, and understanding them was part of being present rather than merely located somewhere. He learned names. The boy who had found him in the clearing was named William, which surprised him slightly. It was an English name, and its presence in this community told him something about the history of the people here, about contact and exchange and the ways that long contact with outsiders changed what people named their children. There was a young man named Arthur who was perhaps 16, and who had the slightly aggressive confidence of a young person who has not yet discovered the limits of their own capability, and who reminded Yiska, with a small pain, of himself at the same age. There was an older woman named Ruth, who moved through the camp with the unhurried authority of someone who knows where everything is and why it is there, who kept track of the food stores and the condition of the tools and the schedule of the tasks that kept 40 people alive in a subarctic winter. He watched how these people interacted, how they communicated with each other, how they managed the difficulties of living at close quarters in a constrained space through the long, cold months. They were good at it, the way people are good at things they have been doing for generations, with a natural ease that looked like it required no effort, but was actually the product of considerable accumulated wisdom about how to make shared life work. He thought about his own community. He thought about the specific dynamics, the specific people, the specific ways that his people had organized themselves and managed their shared life. He thought about the differences he was noticing here, small differences in the way things were done, different solutions to the same problems that all winter camps faced. He stored these observations. He did not know yet what he would do with them, but storing them was a habit built from years of understanding that knowledge is an investment whose return is often long delayed. On the third day, a man arrived from the east, a traveler, a trader who moved between communities in this region, carrying news and small goods. He was a stocky, energetic man named George, perhaps 40 years old, who had the particular manner of someone whose life was built on being everywhere, and knowing everyone, and remembering everything. He arrived at the camp in the late morning, and was welcomed immediately, and by the time he had been fed and had his outer clothing dried by the fire, he was talking. George had news from several communities to the east and north, news about the winter, about the hunting, about the general condition of things, and he had news from the west, which he delivered with the careful manner of someone who understands that news from the west, this winter, was not simple news. He had heard, from a trader who had heard from another, about a group of men who had been operating in the Western Territories. 6 men, he said. He did not say it as though he was surprised. He said it the way a person says something that confirms what they already suspected. He said that the group had been in the territory since the previous autumn, and had done things there that were known and named, and that he would not repeat in detail. Yiska listened without interrupting. George said that the group had pursued someone through the winter, following them east, and that the pursuit had ended badly for most of the group at a lake, an incident that 2 survivors had reported when they staggered into a post to the southwest some days ago. He paused and looked at Yiska when he said this. Yiska met his eyes and said nothing. George said, "Whoever did that was very smart." Yiska said, "Whoever did that was very afraid, and had a grandfather who told them true things." George looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who understands something he is not going to press further, and changed the subject. After that, the nature of Yiska's presence in the camp shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not in ways that made him uncomfortable, but he was aware of a change. People who had treated him as a traveler in need of recovery now treated him additionally as something else, as a person whose story was known, at least in outline, and whose presence carried the weight of that story. It was not unwelcome. It was simply different. He had spent a year being completely anonymous in the wilderness, a person whose identity was known only to himself, and now he was becoming known again, and that too was a kind of re-entry into the human world. He thought about who he was in the account that was now circulating. He did not know exactly how it was being told, or how it would change in the telling. Stories always changed. That was not a failure of stories, but part of their nature, the way they adapted to each teller and each audience, retaining their essential truth while adjusting their surface. The truth he wanted to remain in this story was simple. A person was hunted, and what saved them was knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that an outsider could not have had. That truth was worth keeping. He hoped it would keep. The days lengthened very slightly, as February edged toward March, the incremental daily addition of light that in this latitude was the first and most reliable sign that the winter's grip was beginning to relax, not release. Releasing would come later, in April and May, and even then, slowly, but relax, the way a very tight thing relaxes by fractions, while remaining fundamentally tight. He noticed each morning's slightly later darkness, and each evening's slightly later dusk, and felt them as a kind of accumulation, a slow building of something that would eventually become spring. He stayed through February. He helped. He listened. He learned the community's rhythms, and the names of all its members, and the stories that defined it, and the history that explained it. He was given a place, a small, specific corner of the shared life, and he occupied it with care. He began to tell stories in the evenings. He had not planned to do this. It began one night when William, the boy, asked him what animals he had seen on his journey east, which was a boy's question, a natural curiosity about the wilderness, and Yiska answered it honestly and in detail, and the answer expanded into a description of a particular morning when he had watched a family of otters at a partially open section of a river, and the description became a story, and by the time the story was finished, 3 other children had gathered, and the old man was there listening too. After that, the evening stories became expected. He told the stories his grandfather had told him, in order, the way his grandfather had insisted they be told, in order, because each one built on the last, and together they constituted not just a collection of stories but an account of a people and their relationship to the world they lived in. He told them in his own language, slowly, and Dorothy would sometimes quietly translate the words that the children did not know, and gradually the stories moved between the 2 languages, the way the knowledge of the lake had moved between the 2 grandfathers, bridging, connecting, finding the shared ground. He did not tell the story of the lake until he was ready. He was not ready for some weeks. When he told it simply. He told it to the children by the fire, going through it in order, from the dogs in the distance, to the stamp carved by moonlight, to the finished trail, and the waiting on the ridge. He did not make it dramatic. He did not add things to it. He told the true version, which was enough, which was more than enough. When he finished, the children were quiet. Then William, who was sitting closest to him, said very seriously, "Did the wolf tracks look real?" Yiska thought about it. He said, "I do not know. I know they were convincing enough. Whether they would have fooled a wolf, I cannot say. Maybe the wolves would have known immediately. Wolves are smarter about wolves than men are." William thought about this for a moment, and then nodded, satisfied. The fire crackled and settled. Outside, the cold pressed down on everything, but here, inside, the warmth held. There was a woman in the camp named Clara, who was perhaps 30 years old, and who had, Yiska noticed, the quality of someone who thought about things carefully before speaking, and then spoke with a precision that indicated the thinking had been worth doing. She was not prominent in the camp's social structure in any formal sense, but he observed that when she spoke, people listened, and that the old man frequently sat near her in group conversations, in a way that suggested he valued her presence. She came to speak with Yiska directly, on his 5th day in the camp. She sat near him without preamble and said, in the careful way she said things, "I have been thinking about what you did at the lake." She said it not as an opening to a conversation about whether it was the right thing to do, which was the conversation Yiska had been having internally since the night it happened, but as though she had been thinking about the mechanics of it, the intellectual problem it represented. She said, "The thing that interests me is how you knew they would trust the wolf tracks over other signs." He looked at her. He said, "They were good trackers, but they were not from here. They knew how to read a trail, but they did not know this specific lake. When you do not know a specific place, you rely on general principles. One of the general principles of winter travel is that if an animal has crossed ice, the ice is safe for that animal's weight. Wolves are large animals. A tracker who sees fresh wolf tracks going across a frozen lake will assume the ice held the wolf, and will assume it will hold a person." She said, "But you added a detail, the pause in the middle." He nodded. She had been listening to the story more carefully than he had realized when he told it. He said, "Yes, a trail that shows an animal moving steadily is a trail that says, 'I went this way.' A trail that shows an animal pausing midway says, 'I went this way and I checked and found nothing to worry about.' The pause makes the confidence more convincing than straight movement would have. Movement can be a habit. A pause is a choice." She thought about this. She said, "You were teaching the ice to speak." He had not thought of it that way before, but when she said it, he recognized it as accurate. He had been constructing a message that the ice and the snow would deliver to men who knew how to read such messages. He had been putting words into the landscape. He said, "Yes, something like that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother told me that the land always speaks. The question is whether you are listening in the right language." He thought about his grandfather saying something similar in different words. He thought about how often, in the months since the spring, he had felt that the land was speaking to him, and that his survival had depended on listening correctly. Not the romantic idea of speaking, not the metaphor of a person having a conversation with a tree. The practical reality of a landscape full of information that was available to anyone who had learned to read it, and was unavailable to those who had not. He said, "Your grandmother and my grandfather would have gotten along very well." Clara smiled at this, a quick, genuine smile that changed her face. They talked for another hour, and in that hour he learned more about the history of the community than he had in the 5 days before, because she talked about it directly and with confidence, the way people talk about things they know well and do not need to approach carefully. She told him about the trading relationships the community maintained, the routes the traders traveled, the other communities they were connected to. She told him about the pressures coming from the east and the north, which were different pressures from the ones Yiska had experienced but were related. Two expressions of the same thing, that was moving across the world and changing it. He listened to all of this with attention. He was gathering information, the way he had always gathered information, because information was what made decisions possible, and decisions were what made survival possible. Before she left, she said, "You should stay. We need people who know how to listen to what the land is saying." She said it simply, without pressure, in the same way she said everything. She said it as a fact she had assessed and determined to be true, which was her way of talking about most things. He said he would think about it. He did think about it, for several days. He thought about what staying would mean, and what it would not mean, and what he would be accepting, and what he would be giving up, and whether there was anything left to give up, given what the year had taken. He thought about whether the people here needed what he had, and whether he needed what they had, and whether those two things together constituted sufficient reason to put down roots in a place that was not the place he had come from. He thought about his grandfather's voice in the evenings, telling the stories in order, one leading to the next. He thought about the specific knowledge he carried, all of it, the route details and the lake secrets and the tracking techniques and the stories and the language, all of it living in him and only in him now, in need of being given to someone before it could go on existing. Knowledge that is in one person only is not safe. One accident, one illness, one bad winter, and it is gone. Knowledge needs to live in more than one person. It needs to be transmitted. It needs to find new minds to take root in. The children here were good listeners. He went to the old man and said he would stay. The old man said, "I know." He said it without surprise, as though he had been waiting for this conclusion, and had simply been patient while Yiska arrived at it. Yiska said, "Is it that obvious?" The old man said, "A person who has nothing to go back to and a purpose in the place where they are tends to stay." He said it without any suggestion that this was sad, because he did not seem to think it was sad. He seemed to think it was the straightforward outcome of the circumstances, which was how he tended to think about most things. Yiska stayed. Spring came in the way spring comes in that country, which is slowly and with reversals, the cold returning after apparent warmth, the snow rebuilding briefly, before surrendering again, the birds arriving in waves that were sometimes interrupted by late storms. He watched the season change with the particular attention of someone who had spent a year in very close contact with the seasons, for whom the turn of winter into spring was not a background event, but a primary one. The river below the camp ran clear when the ice went out in April, and he stood on the bank watching the ice move south, and thought about how that ice had formed upstream sometime in October or November, slowly, piece by piece, building over the moving water the way all substantial things build, and had traveled the whole length of the river under its snow cover, and was now going out at the bottom, breaking up and running south and disappearing into the wider water. He thought about how this was something like a year of his life, moving through a landscape and breaking up at the end of it and flowing away. He was still here, though. He had not flowed away. He was on the bank watching the ice go. That spring he helped with the planting of the early crops in the small garden spaces the community maintained, and he helped with the fishing when the fish returned to the river, and he learned more of the community's language, filling in the gaps he had been bridging with approximations since his arrival. His tongue learned the new sounds gradually, the way a river learns a new channel, cutting it a little deeper with each passing. He taught as he learned. He taught William and the other children words in his own language, small words first, the words for simple things, and as the spring continued he taught them the names for things in the landscape, the birds and the plants and the weather signs and the fish and their habits. He taught them to notice things. That was, ultimately, what his grandfather had taught him, and what he was now teaching them. Not specific knowledge so much as the habit of attention, the willingness to look carefully at the world around you, and to remember what you see, and to ask what it means. One afternoon in early summer he was working near the river with Arthur, the confident young man who reminded him of himself at that age, and Arthur asked him something that no one had asked him directly in the months since his arrival. Arthur said, "When you were out there alone, all those months, what did you think about?" Yiska considered the question seriously, because it was serious, and Arthur was asking it seriously, not making conversation. He said, "I thought about staying alive. Most of the time, that was all there was room for. The cold, and the food, and the direction, and the day's problems took up most of the space." Arthur said, "And the rest of the time?" Yiska said, "I thought about the things I had been taught. Every time I needed to do something I did not know how to do, I found that I actually knew how to do it, because someone had taught me and I had stored it without knowing I would need it. The lake, the crossing places on rivers, the snare placements, the ice reading. I was always finding that I already knew the thing I needed to know, because someone had thought to tell me before the moment of need arrived." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like they were still with you." Yiska had thought about this. He said, "Yes, that is one way to say it. All the people who had taught me things were still with me in the only form that endures after a person is gone, which is the form of what they knew, living in the people they told it to." Arthur was 17 and had the seriousness of a person who is beginning to understand that the world is more complicated than it appeared when he was younger. He took this in and held it, and Yiska could see him turning it over. He said nothing more. He let the young man think. That was something else his grandfather had taught him, that sometimes the most useful thing you can do after saying something true is to stop talking and let the truth settle. The summer was long and full. He participated in the trading visits that came and went through the camp, meeting people from other communities in the network that extended through this part of the territory. He met a man from the Far East who spoke a language so different from his own that they had almost no words in common, and had to communicate almost entirely through gesture and expression, and the occasional shared word that had traveled through enough intermediary languages to have cousins in both of theirs. He found this deeply interesting, not frustrating. The problem of communication across a large gap was the same kind of problem as the problem of navigation through unknown terrain. It required patience and attention and willingness to try something again, from a different angle, when the first approach did not work. He heard, through the trading network, more about the two men who had survived the lake. They had made it back. They had reported the incident. There had been some discussion of consequence, some talk of pursuing the matter. But pursuit in the subarctic winter was not a simple matter, and the two men had survived in large part because of the support of their organization, and their organization had assessed the cost of continued pursuit and found it unfavorable. The man they had been following was gone, was somewhere to the east, was not worth what finding him would cost, now that he was beyond the easy reach of the Western operations. Yiska heard this news with the same careful attention he brought to all news. He stored it. He noted that the threat had diminished, that the immediate danger was probably past. He also noted that such things had a way of changing, that decisions made under one set of circumstances were sometimes revised when the circumstances changed. He kept a portion of his attention, always, on the question of what was coming from the west. It was not a large portion, not the overwhelming vigilance of a person in immediate danger, just a thread of awareness maintained, a habit of watchfulness, that the year had built in him, and that he saw no reason to relinquish completely. He thought it was probably a habit he would keep for the rest of his life. That was all right. Some habits built in difficult times were worth keeping. Autumn came, and with autumn the beginning of the cold again, the first frosts arriving at night, while the days were still warm enough to feel like summer's last argument. He watched the season turn with the recognition of a person for whom the cycle was now deeply familiar, not just familiar as a remembered thing, but familiar as a present thing, a thing being experienced rather than recalled. He had earned a different relationship with winter over the past year, not a comfortable relationship but a direct one, a relationship without illusions or expectations in either direction. He prepared for winter with the community, doing the work of preparation that was now known to him, the stacking and storing and repairing and sealing against the cold that kept 40 people alive through the cold months. He worked alongside people he had come to know well, Dorothy and George when he passed through, and William, who was growing and would be tall, and Arthur, who was beginning to show the signs of a maturity that was going to be considerable. One evening in November, when the cold had arrived in earnest and the long nights had come back, Yiska sat with the old man after the children were asleep and the camp had gone quiet. They sat by a small fire and drank something hot and were quiet together for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was a comfortable and communicative quiet rather than an empty one. The old man said, eventually, "Do you miss it?" He meant the West, the home territory. Yiska said yes. He said it honestly, without softening it. He said, "I miss the specific trees, the specific river bends, the quality of the light in certain seasons at certain times of day. Those things are not replaceable. That particular light does not exist here. I know that. I have accepted that." The old man said, "What do you have instead?" Yiska looked at the fire. He said, "Different trees, different river bends, different light, and the knowledge that I carried from there to here, which is still here, still in me, still being told to the children in the evenings. That knowledge did not die when everything else did. It is still alive. As long as I tell it, it is still alive." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And when you are no longer here to tell it?" Yiska said, "William is a very good listener." The old man smiled. He said, "Yes, he is." They sat with the fire between them and let the night deepen around the camp, the cold pressing at the walls and the fire doing its patient work of holding the cold back, which fires have been doing since before either of them or anyone they knew had been alive. Yiska thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about his grandfather. He thought about the old man pressing his knowledge into his grandson, the way Yiska had pressed false wolf tracks into the snow of the lake, carefully, with attention to detail, with the understanding that what was being made was a trail for someone to follow, not a trail across ice, a trail through time. His grandfather had been afraid of many things. Yiska had understood this even as a child, because his grandfather spoke about his fears openly, which is the way of people who have decided that fear is information rather than weakness and should be treated accordingly. His grandfather had been afraid of the knowledge dying, of the stories stopping, of the chain breaking somewhere in the middle, and the knowledge that had been passed down through generations simply disappearing, becoming unavailable to the future, because no one was there to carry it forward. He had passed his fears along with his knowledge, because they were related, because understanding what was worth being afraid of was part of understanding what was worth preserving. Yiska understood now, in a way he had not fully understood when his grandfather was alive, how large that fear was, how much courage it took to address it not by being afraid, but by doing the thing that the fear pointed toward, which was teaching. Teaching everyone who would sit still and listen. Teaching until you did not have anyone left to teach, and then hoping that what you had given was enough to go forward without you. He had been afraid too, on the ice of the lake that night. He had been afraid every step he took on the thin section, afraid as he pressed each stamp into the snow, afraid as he backed away and brushed his tracks. Fear was present from the moment he stepped onto the ice, to the moment he climbed up between the rocks on the ridge and lay still. And the fear had not stopped him. That was the only thing that mattered about the fear. Not whether it was present, not whether it was reasonable, but whether it stopped you or did not. His grandfather's fear of the knowledge dying had not stopped him from teaching. Yiska's fear on the ice had not stopped him from working. The fear was information. The information said, "This matters. This is worth being careful about. This deserves your full attention." He had given it his full attention. He was still here. The fire settled lower. The old man's eyes had closed, not asleep but resting. Outside, the wind was beginning to move through the trees again, picking up from the north in the way it did when the temperature was going to drop further before morning. Yiska pulled his outer layer around himself and sat with the fire and the quiet and the knowledge of all the days that had led to this evening, the lake and the trail and the months of cold and the boy with the firewood and the broth and the old man and the stories and the children listening. He was not who he had been before the spring. That person was gone, had been gone since the spring, and Yiska had made a kind of peace with that. He was who the year had made him, and who the year had made him was someone he was still getting to know, someone whose full extent had not yet revealed itself, someone who had things still ahead. He did not know what those things were. He was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely curious to find out. The fire burned down. He put another piece of wood on it. He sat and waited for morning. Winter passed the way this winter was always going to pass, which was slowly, with cold that was serious and demanded constant attention, and dark that was long and sometimes felt absolute, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to the wilderness in January, when everything that can be still is still, and the only sounds are the ones that cold and wind make, moving through wood and snow. He had lived through this kind of winter before, many of them, and this one was not worse than the others in any of its components. What was different was that he was not alone in it. That difference was immense. He had understood in the abstract, during the 11 months of solitude, that being alone was hard. He had understood it as a practical reality. No one to share the work, no one to watch the camp while you slept, no one to help carry, no one to consult when you were uncertain. These were real deprivations, and he had felt them. But he had not understood, until he was no longer alone, what the other deprivation had been. The deprivation of being known, of being someone whose presence registered to other people, whose words were heard, whose work was witnessed, whose existence mattered in the daily calculations of a group, rather than existing in a private vacuum. The first time Dorothy said his name across the camp in a tone of voice that simply expected him to hear it and come, and he heard it and came, and helped with what was needed, and went back to what he had been doing, the ordinariness of it was so striking that he had to stop and let it settle. His name in someone else's voice, asking him for something, meaning him specifically among all the people in the world. He had not had that in a year. He was grateful for it in a way that surprised him with its intensity. March brought the first real signs of the season turning. Not warmth. The temperatures in March were still serious, and could still kill you if you made errors. But light. Real light. Lengthening visibly now, the morning arriving a little earlier, and the afternoon holding on a little later, in a way that was measurable day to day. He noticed it every morning, this accumulation of light, and filed it internally as a form of progress. Progress toward the season that would make everything easier, that would open the rivers and bring back the birds and release the land from the compression of cold. He began to teach William in a more systematic way that month. The boy was old enough and serious enough and had demonstrated sufficient interest to warrant the kind of deliberate teaching, rather than the incidental teaching that had been happening naturally in the months since Yiska arrived. He told the old man what he intended, out of respect for the community's structures, and the old man said, "Good." He has been wanting this. He was waiting for you to see it. The teaching was not formal in any way that would have been recognizable to someone who expected teaching to look a certain way. It happened while they were doing other things, gathering wood, checking the trap lines, walking the creek to read the condition of the ice and water. Yiska talked and William listened, and sometimes William asked questions that were better questions than Yiska expected, and sometimes Yiska asked questions that made William think harder than he had been thinking, and the knowledge moved between them in both directions, which was the way real teaching always went. He taught William the route signs his mother had described to him. He taught him the specific landmark system, the flat-topped hill, and the river with the island, and the rocky south-facing outcrop, and he added to this the landmarks he had discovered himself, on the 12-day walk east, the things he had noticed that were not in his mother's description, but that existed and could be relied on. He was building a denser map than the one he had arrived with, and he was transmitting it. He taught William the ice reading his grandfather had taught him, going out onto a section of the creek in early March, when the ice was still reliable, but not what it had been in January, and showing him how to listen, and feel, and read the signs. He described the springs and what they did to ice. He described the lake, not telling the full story yet, not the crisis story, but the knowledge story, where the lake was and what it was, and why it was what it was, what the springs did, and how to find where they ran, how to tell safe ice from unsafe ice, by signs that were subtle but real, and learnable. William was a good learner. He had the quality that the best learners always had, which was not quickness. Quickness was pleasant, but not essential, but depth. He held things. When Yiska told him something in March, William still had it in April, and could repeat it back without prompting, not word for word, but in the substance, in the truth of it. He was building a real knowledge structure, piece by piece, the way good structures are built, and when new pieces arrived, they found their place and stayed there. Yiska watched this happening, and felt something that was difficult to name, but was related to what he imagined his grandfather had felt teaching him, which was the particular satisfaction of giving something away and watching it become real in another person, watching knowledge go from one consciousness into another, and take root there, and begin to grow. Spring arrived finally in May, the real spring, the irreversible spring, the one that came with the full return of the birds, and the breakup of the ice on the river, and the smell of the earth returning under the retreating snow. The camp changed with the season, people moving more, working outside rather than inside, the pace increasing with the returning light and warmth, the annual expansion of possibility that spring represented after the annual compression of winter. He walked one morning to the top of the ridge to the north of the camp, and stood looking west. He was not looking for anything specific. He was simply looking west, which was the direction everything had come from, the direction of his home territory, the direction of the lake. He tried to feel what he expected to feel standing here looking west. He tried to feel grief, or loss, or the sharp specific ache of homesickness. He felt all of those things, but they were underneath something else now, deeper under, not gone but not at the surface anymore. What was at the surface was something more like steadiness, a calm, that was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a kind of ground under the feelings, a place to stand. He had survived. That was simple and enormous, and contained everything else inside it, the way a river contains all the water that has ever passed through it, without the water being visible in the river anymore. He turned east and walked back down to the camp. George the trader arrived in early May, as he often did when the routes opened up, and he brought news and trade goods and his inexhaustible supply of other people's stories from across the territory. He sat with Yiska one evening and they talked for a long time, and George said something that had been waiting in the trading networks and had been passed along through several people before reaching them here. He said that a person in one of the eastern communities had written something down, not in one of the indigenous languages, which were mostly oral, but in the language of the outsiders, which some people in the region had learned in the years of increasing contact. He said that this person had written down, among other things, an account they had received of a man who had survived a long pursuit in the Western Territories by using false wolf tracks on a frozen lake. Yiska listened to this without speaking. George said, "They have your story, in writing." Yiska thought about this. He thought about what it meant for a story to be written down. In his own tradition, the stories were oral, passed from voice to voice, which gave them a kind of flexibility. They could adjust. They could carry the marks of each teller, They could grow and breathe. Writing fixed things. It held them in one form, which was a kind of preservation, but also a kind of constraint. He said, "Do they have it right?" George shrugged. He said, "I heard it third hand. It sounded like the shape of it was correct." Yiska thought about the shape of it. The shape was what mattered most. The shape was, a person was hunted and used knowledge of a specific place to survive when more straightforward forms of resistance had been exhausted. The shape was, local knowledge defeated outsider expertise in the place where the local knowledge lived. That shape was true and was worth preserving. He said, "Then I am glad it is written." George looked at him with the measuring expression of a person assessing whether the sentiment is genuine. He decided it was, and nodded. He said, "There are people who want to know your name." Yiska thought about this differently. He thought about what his name was in the account that would circulate. He thought about whether being named was useful or dangerous, whether being identified specifically made him more or less safe, whether the two men who had survived the lake had given his description to anyone who would continue to look for him. He said, "Let them have the story. The name can wait." George accepted this without argument. He understood, which was one of the things that made him a reliable person to know, that some decisions were not his to push against. Later that evening, after George had gone to his own shelter, Yiska sat outside for a while in the mild spring air, the first truly mild air in many months, and thought about stories and names and what got written down and what did not. He thought about his grandfather, whose name was not written anywhere in any language, who existed in the world now only in the things he had taught, in the people who carried those teachings, in the stories that continued because he had told them. He was in the specific weight of Yiska's hands when they carved wood, in the habit of reading ice by feel and sound, in the route his mother had learned from him that had reached Yiska and guided him east. He was in the children by the fire in the evenings. He was in William. His name did not need to be written anywhere for him to be real. Yiska looked at the stars, which were coming out in the early evening sky, with the unhurried confidence of things that have been there a very long time and intend to remain. He thought about the lake. He thought about it less often now than he had in the first weeks. It still came, sometimes at night, sometimes in a quiet moment during the day. The sound, the torches, the flat dark quiet that followed. He did not expect this to stop entirely, and he had decided that was all right. The lake was part of what had made him what he was now. He did not need it to be something other than what it was. He only needed to carry it, without letting it carry him. He had survived. He was useful. He was telling stories. He was still here. That was what mattered, and it was enough, and it had always been enough. And on this mild May evening in the camp, under the flat-topped hill, with the river running clear below, and the birds calling in the trees, and the fire inside warm against the growing dark, he let it be enough. He went inside. The children were waiting for the evening story. He sat down. He began to tell it. The second winter was easier. Not because it was less cold or less dark or less demanding, but because he was less alone in it, in every sense of the word. He had the community and the structures it had built over generations to hold back the worst of what winter could do, and he had his own accumulated knowledge of this specific territory, which was richer now by a full year's observation and experience. And he had the stories, which he continued to tell in the evenings, and which continued to grow in the telling. Because stories grow when they are told to people who respond to them, when the listener's attention calls something out of the story that had not been visible before. He had acquired something else too, which was a relationship with Clara. It had not been his intention. He had not been looking for it, had not known he was moving toward it, until he was already there, which was perhaps the way the most real things arrive. They had continued to talk, through the spring and summer and into the fall, the way two people talk when they are both thinkers, and have found another thinker to think with. They talked about the community and the territory, and the history of both, about the knowledge that was being preserved, and the knowledge that was being lost, about what the next decades were likely to bring, from the world that was pressing in from the outside. They talked about her grandmother and his grandfather, who had both been people of particular wisdom, and what wisdom looked like when you were actually watching it, rather than reading about it afterward. The relationship between them was not dramatic. It was not the subject of much public attention in the camp. It was a quiet thing, a gradual thing, the kind of growing that happens between two people who are both busy with real work and discover that the other person is always slightly more interesting than the alternatives, and that this persists without any evidence of stopping. He told her about the spring eventually. He had not told anyone the full account, not the old man, not George, not the children. He had told the account of the lake, but not the account of what came before it. He told her in late summer, on a walk along the river, speaking slowly, and with pauses between the parts. And she listened in the way she listened, completely, and without trying to shape what she was hearing into something more comfortable. When he finished, she did not say anything immediately. They walked for a while. Then she said, "You had been carrying that alone for over a year." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is a long time to carry something like that." He said, "There was no one to give it to." She said, "There is now." He understood what she meant, that the carrying did not have to be as complete anymore, as total, as the act of a person who is the only point of support for something, and must therefore bear all of it themselves. There was someone to give some of it to, not to take it away, not to make it smaller or lighter necessarily, but to share the weight, which was different from removing it, but was still a significant difference. He gave her some of it. She held it without flinching, which he had expected, because she was that kind of person. He held her portion of what she had been carrying, which was not the same kind of weight, but was also real and heavy in its own ways. The things that a woman carries who has been paying attention in a world that is changing, and not always changing in directions that are good for the people she loves. They carried each other's things, going forward, which is what people do when they have decided to go forward together. The second winter had William in it, as a different presence than the first winter had been. He was taller and more serious, and the systematic teaching had given him a different quality of knowledge than the incidental learning had. He knew things now. He knew them with confidence, with the security of understanding, rather than the fragility of recent acquisition. He read ice correctly every time they went out to test it. He could navigate by stars and by landmark with reliability. He knew the snare placements and the run systems, and the signs of animals, and the habits of the river in different seasons. He was also beginning to teach. He taught the younger children some of what he knew, naturally and without being asked, because that was what happened when knowledge reached a person who held it well. It wanted to keep moving. Yiska watched this happen and felt the particular satisfaction of a process working correctly. The old man was slower in the second winter, which was the way old men went in the cold, the body's reserves not rebuilding as completely as they had the year before. Yiska spent more time with him, not because the old man asked him to, but because the old man had given him a great deal, and because time was the only currency that mattered between people who cared about each other. They continued to talk by the fire in the evenings. They talked about the territory, and its history, and the people who had lived in it, and the things they had known. They talked about the trading network, and how it was changing. They talked about language, and how language changed, and what happened to knowledge when the language it lived in changed. The old man had opinions about all of these things that were worth hearing, and Yiska heard them carefully and considered them seriously, even when he did not fully agree, because disagreement with a person of long experience was an education in what was at stake. One evening in February, the old man said something that Yiska had been thinking about for months, without quite knowing what he thought. He said, "You know, what you did at the lake will be told for a long time." He said it simply, as an observation. He said, "Long after you are gone, people will tell about the man who made wolf tracks on the ice, the way they tell about such things." Yiska had thought about this. He said, "I hope they tell the true part, not just the trick, the reason the trick worked." The old man said, "Which part is that?" Yiska said, "The springs. The knowledge of the springs. That is the true part. Without that, there is no trick. Without the knowledge passed down by my grandfather, I would have walked out onto that lake and fallen through myself. The trick is only a trick because of the knowledge. If they tell just the trick, they are missing most of the story." The old man considered this. He said, "Most stories that become famous lose something when they become famous. The part that is lost is usually the part that is hardest to hold on to, the part that requires context to understand." Yiska said, "Then I should keep telling the part they might lose." The old man said, "Yes, you should." He kept telling it. In the evenings, in the stories, he kept telling the part about the springs and the knowledge and the chain of transmission, the grandfather, who had known the lake and had told his grandson, and the other grandfather in another community, who had been told the same thing, and had told his grandchildren, and how two half-truths about a specific lake had waited in two different places until they converged in one night and one person who had both of them. He told it until William knew it, until the younger children knew it, until it was in enough minds that losing one mind would not lose the knowledge. That was how it stayed alive. That was how everything stayed alive. 3 years after he had walked into the camp following a small boy with an armload of firewood, Yiska was working near the river when he saw something that made him stop. A man was coming along the bank from the south, traveling alone, with the pack and the walk of someone who had been traveling for a significant time. He was young, perhaps 20, and very thin, and moving with the careful, controlled pace of someone who had learned not to waste motion. Yiska went to the bank and called to him. The young man came over. He was from the south and west, from a territory that Yiska knew by reputation, and had been to once, years before any of this. He said he had been traveling for 3 weeks. He said he was looking for a community where he might stay and learn and be useful, because the community he had come from was no longer safe for him, in a way that he described carefully and without unnecessary detail. Yiska understood this description. He said, "Come." He brought the young man into the camp. His name was Edward. He was a good listener. The story of the wolf tracks and the lake was told for a long time after that winter. It moved through the trading networks and through the oral traditions of several communities, changing slightly in each telling, the way true stories always change, the details adjusting to the teller's experience and the listener's context, but the shape of it remaining recognizable. A man alone, a frozen lake, a piece of knowledge inherited from a grandfather, and a trail made of lies that led the hunters onto ice that would not hold them. In 1901, a man named Frederick, who worked with an organization concerned with the documentation of indigenous oral traditions, came through the region and stayed with an aging community elder whose grandfather had known Yiska. Frederick wrote down many things that winter. He wrote in careful, precise English, trying to capture what he heard without changing it too much, though he understood that the act of writing always changed things somewhat, that putting into one language what had lived in another was a transformation, even when it was faithful. He wrote down the story of the wolf tracks. He noted in his journal that the account had been told to him by an elder who had heard it from her mother, who had heard it from an elder who had known the man in his final years. He noted that the man's name, as the community referred to it, did not translate directly into English, and that he would render it as best he could. He noted that the community remembered the man primarily as a storyteller and a teacher, and that his specific survival event, while frequently cited, was understood by the people who told it as secondary to the work he had done for 30 years, passing on the knowledge of a destroyed community, so that the knowledge would not die with the community. He noted that the community had a particular name for the lake where the events had occurred. The name meant something close to the place where the knowledge proved itself. He noted that the community considered this name accurate and important. He noted that the elder, when he asked her what lesson she drew from the story, thought for a long time before answering. Then she said, "The lesson is not that cleverness can defeat force, though sometimes it can. The lesson is that knowledge belongs to the person who carries it, and that it goes with them wherever they go, and that it can be used anywhere that the world presents the right conditions for it. The springs existed under that lake before any person ever knew about them. Knowing about them did not change them, but having that knowledge available, at the right moment, in the right person, that changed everything." Frederick wrote this down carefully. He underlined it. He kept the notes his whole life, and they were published after his death, in a small volume of collected oral accounts that was read by perhaps 300 people over the following decades, and that sat in a university library, where it gathered the particular kind of dust that important things gather when they are waiting to be found. Eventually someone found it. The story went on moving. That is what true things do. They are not finished when the moment that made them is finished. They find their way forward through whatever channels are available, through voices and writing and memory, and the particular way a story shifts from a historical event into a piece of knowledge about how things work, which is the highest form any story can reach. Yiska had understood this. He had spent 30 years after the lake making sure the things he knew would not stop with him. He had taught William and Clara and Edward and the younger children, and the children after them, and the knowledge had moved, not perfectly, not without loss, but substantially, in enough of its truth to remain useful. The springs under the lake continued to run. The ice continued to be thin there in winter. The people who lived near it continued to know why. That was the inheritance, not gold, not land, not anything that could be held in a hand. The inheritance was the knowledge of what lay under the surface of a specific piece of winter ice, and why it mattered, and how a person could use that knowledge when the need arose. It was enough. It had always been enough. A man had walked onto that ice one January night with cold hands, and a wooden stamp, and something his grandfather had told him, and he had walked back off it alone, and that was terrible, and he had carried the terrible thing with him for the rest of his life, and he had also carried the knowledge, and the knowledge was what he gave away, and what he gave away was what lasted. William was an old man himself when he told the story to his own grandchildren. He told it on winter evenings by the fire, in the order it had been told to him, with the context that had been told to him. First the springs, then the lake, then the knowledge of the springs, then the man alone in the dark with the wooden stamp, then the waiting on the ridge, then the sound, then the long walk east. He told it carefully, he told it truly. He told the part that was hardest to hold on to, not the cleverness of it, not the drama of the ice giving way, but the fact that the cleverness rested entirely on something learned from a grandfather, on an evening that had seemed at the time to be an ordinary evening, which was exactly how the important evenings always seemed. You are sitting by a fire, the old man is talking, and you are listening, and you think, this is just a story, this is just an old man telling me about a lake. And then one night, years later, you are on a ridge in the dark, watching men walk out onto that lake, and the story has become a tool in your hands, and it was the difference, the whole difference, between your life and not your life. Pay attention. Listen carefully. The evening that seems ordinary may be the evening that holds everything. That is what the story said. That is what it has always said. That is what it says now. Yiska had been watching the sky for 2 hours when the light changed. It was not a dramatic change, not the sudden shift that comes before a storm, but the slow, incremental darkening of the afternoon in January that meant the sun was running out of arc before it had gotten very high to begin with. In the deep of winter, at these latitudes, the sun came up and went down without ever managing to get properly overhead, sliding along the southern horizon like a thought you could not quite bring into focus, giving light without warmth, present but not sufficient. He had lived his whole life under this kind of sky, and still he felt the daily departure of the light as a small thing to manage, a small discipline of not letting the going of the light become the going of one's own steadiness. He thought about his grandfather again, which he had been doing more frequently in the past days. His grandfather had been a man who talked about fear in a way that was unusual. Most people, in Yiska's experience, treated fear as an embarrassment, something to be overcome and not discussed, a weakness in the architecture of the self that should be shored up and not pointed out. His grandfather had disagreed with this approach comprehensively and openly. Fear, his grandfather had said, was the most useful emotion available to a thinking person, because fear was the emotion that told you what was real. Everything else was negotiable. Fear was not. When you were afraid, something genuinely frightening was in the area. The question was not how to stop being afraid, but how to think clearly while you were. He had thought clearly while he was afraid on the ice. He was certain of this now, in a way he had not been certain of it while it was happening. In the moment, you could not evaluate clearly whether you were thinking clearly, because the thing doing the evaluating was the same thing that might or might not be thinking clearly. It was only afterward, reviewing the decisions and their outcomes, that you could assess the quality of the thinking. His thinking on the ice had been good. The stamp had been carved correctly. The tracks had been convincing. The placement over the thin section had been exact. Fear plus clear thinking. That was what the lake had required, and that was what the lake had gotten. He did not know whether to attribute this to his grandfather's teaching or to the year of sustained difficulty that had left him, for better and worse, with fewer options for panic. When the only things available to you are clear thinking and action, you tend to develop them. The year had developed them in him the way cold develops a person's awareness of heat, by removing the context in which they could be taken for granted. He moved northeast, working his way along a contour line that kept him out of the deepest snow in the valleys, while avoiding the exposed ridge lines where the wind was worst. He was reading the terrain with the unconscious fluency that came from years of practice, choosing paths that a person without that practice would not have seen, finding the slightly firmer snow, the more sheltered routes, the angles of approach that delivered the most progress for the least energy. He was very good at moving through this landscape. He had always been good at it, from the time he was a child following older people through the same kinds of terrain. The year had made him better. He thought, as he moved, about Edward. Edward had arrived 3 years ago and had stayed, and in the 3 years of his staying, he had become someone Yiska watched with the particular attention of a teacher, who recognizes in a student something that exceeds ordinary aptitude. Edward was 23 now, and in 3 years he had absorbed an enormous amount of what Yiska had taught, had absorbed it with the completeness and the integration that distinguished real learning from the surface form. He asked questions that indicated he had already thought carefully about the thing before asking, that the question was the end of a process of independent reasoning rather than the beginning of one. He made connections between pieces of knowledge that Yiska had not explicitly made, finding the relationships himself. He was building something. Yiska was not certain what it was yet, but he could feel its architecture in the quality of Edward's attention and the sharpness of his questions. He was also physically capable in ways that had emerged gradually over the 3 years, as the deprivation of his journey showed itself, and then reversed under adequate food and shelter and work. He was tall, which Yiska had not been able to assess when he arrived, because a man who has been walking for 3 weeks and eating poorly shrinks into himself in ways that affect apparent size. Fed and rested, Edward was tall and strong, with the economical movement of someone who had learned, as Yiska had learned, to waste nothing. He would be good out here. That thought arrived in Yiska's mind with a quiet certainty, and he let it rest there without examining it immediately, the way you let a thing you are still forming leave the space to form itself. He found a campsite in the late afternoon, earlier than he usually stopped, but the site was too good to pass. A natural windbreak, a dry space under 2 fallen trees that formed a right angle against the cold, good dry wood available from the deadfall around him. He set up carefully, building the camp with the methodical attention to detail that distinguished a good winter camp from an ordinary one, which was often the difference between a comfortable night and a dangerous one. He built a small fire, the smallest one that would do the work needed. He was far enough from the lake now that the smoke was not a concern the way it had been in the first days. He was in open country, and the 2 survivors from the lake were almost certainly back where they had started from by now, reporting what had happened, making the calculations that organizations like theirs made when operations did not go as planned. He did not think they would send more people. Not soon. Not this winter. The cost was too high, and the return was uncertain, and the territory was not cooperative to that kind of pursuit, once a target had put enough distance between them. He ate by the fire, and watched the flames, and let his mind move through what still remained to be done. In the morning he would set snares on 2 likely runs he had noticed on his way in. He would check them in the late morning after enough time had passed for an animal to make the mistake of a run at the wrong hour. He would continue east, regardless of the snare's success, because east was the direction, and delay was not his friend. If the snares delivered, he would eat well and continue stronger. If they did not, he would continue on what he had. He thought about Clara. She would be wondering, by now, where he was and how far east he had gone. They had not spoken before he left about what this trip was, or why he needed to make it. He had simply said he needed to walk into the Western Territory for a few days, to look at something, and she had looked at him with the measuring attention she brought to everything and said, "All right." She had not asked the question he had expected, the question of why or what he was looking for. She had simply accepted that he needed to go, and said, "Be careful," and let him go. He was grateful for this, as he was grateful for many things about Clara that he had not known he would need until he needed them. He thought about what he was going back to look at, and why. He had told himself, coming east on the 12-day walk years ago, that he would not return to the lake. He had made that statement to himself in the darkness east of the ridge where he had watched the men go out onto the ice, walking away from it with the deliberateness of someone putting a door between themselves and a room they were not ready to enter. He had not returned. In the years since, the lake had remained where it was in his mind, significant, present, not processed but held, in the room behind the closed door. He was ready to open the door. He was returning to the lake. Not to the men, not to the events, not to any of it in the way that a person relives a thing when they cannot leave it behind. He was returning to the lake itself, to the specific geography, to the water and the ice and the springs beneath, to the place that his grandfather's knowledge had made possible for him, the place that had been, in the most direct sense, where his life had turned. He wanted to stand there and look at it in whatever season it currently was, which was spring, the ice going or gone, the water moving again, the surface clear and cold and reflecting whatever sky was above it. He wanted to see it as a lake, not as a trap, not as a strategy, not as a night in January, but as a place, as the specific body of water in the specific landscape that his grandfather had described to him when he was 8 years old, sitting by a fire on an evening that had seemed ordinary. He slept by the small fire with the assurance of someone who had been sleeping in these conditions long enough to do it correctly, wrapped and positioned, and with the fire managed in the way that kept it useful, without requiring constant tending. He woke once in the night, when a branch fell from a tree to the north, snapping in the cold, and registered the sound and its cause, and closed his eyes again, without having been fully awake. In the morning the snares had one hare, which he cooked and ate in full, and then he covered his tracks as best he could out of old habit, and continued west, toward the lake. He saw it from the ridge where he had lain between the rocks, and this time he saw it in daylight, which was different. The ice was gone. The lake was open water, dark and still in the early morning, reflecting a sky that was pale blue, with a few white clouds moving from the northwest. The far bank was visible, the spruce trees coming down to the water's edge. The shore where he stood, or near it, still had some dirty snow in the shadows of the trees, but in the open areas, the ground was bare and brown, and beginning to show the first green suggestions of what would come. He walked down to the shore. He stood at the water's edge and looked out at the center of the lake. The place where the springs ran beneath the surface was invisible now, unmarked, just water, like any other water on the surface. The springs were still there, still running, still doing what they had done for longer than memory reached. The ice that had been there in January had been gone for months. The false wolf trail had gone with it. The marks of what had happened were nowhere on the surface of the lake. The lake did not remember. He stood at the water's edge for a long time. He thought about his grandfather telling him about this lake. He thought about the specific evening, which he could not place exactly in time, but which lived clearly in his memory as an evening event. Firelight, the smell of wood smoke and cooked food, his grandfather's voice unhurried in the way his voice always was when he was telling something important. He had been perhaps 8. He had been listening because that was what children did when elders talked, because his grandfather had always made stories worth listening to, because there was nothing in particular competing for his attention at that hour. He had not known he would need the information. He had not known that it would become, in the fullness of time, the thing that kept him alive. He bent down and put his hand in the water at the lake's edge. It was cold, very cold, the cold of snowmelt and underground springs, the cold of water that had been frozen for months and had only recently been freed. He held his hand in it for a moment and felt the cold going into his palm, and then he took his hand out and let the water run off and stood up. He said something quiet to the lake, not in the language of the outsiders but in his own language, the language he still carried, and still taught, and still told stories in. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way a person says something that is for the hearing of the place rather than any other listener. He thanked the lake for being what it was. He thanked his grandfather for knowing what the lake was and for telling him. He thanked the network of knowledge, the chain of transmission, the grandfathers and grandmothers who had told the true things to children sitting by fires on evenings that seemed ordinary, who had not known which particular piece of truth would prove essential to which particular person, in which particular moment of need. He thanked all of them. Then he turned and walked back up the ridge. He walked east for 5 days and came back to the camp in the late afternoon of the 5th day, coming through the trees and smelling the fires and hearing the sounds of the camp going about its business. William was the first person he saw, which was fitting, and William looked at him with the unhurried, assessing look that he had had as a child and had grown into as a young man, and said, "Did you find what you went looking for?" Yiska said, "Yes." William said, "Good." He said it simply, without asking what it was, because William had grown into a person who understood that some answers were complete in themselves. Clara was inside when he came in. She looked at him in the specific way she had of reading him, taking in his condition, and his manner, and the quality of his tiredness, and his face, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You look better." He said, "I am better." She put food in front of him, and he sat down and ate, and the camp moved around him in its ordinary daily way, and the fire did its work, and he was home. He had not thought of the camp as home for a while. He had been thinking of it as where he lived, which was accurate but incomplete. Home was the word, he realized, sitting by the fire with Clara's hand on his shoulder and William's voice from outside in the camp. Home was the correct and full word, because home was not where you had come from, but where you were known, where your presence changed the space, where you would be missed if you were gone. He was home. He stayed home. He told stories in the evenings for many more years, and the stories went on living, after he could no longer tell them, carried in the minds of the people who had listened, who told them to their own children, who told their children, who told theirs. The lake continued to be what it had always been, in winter and summer, in drought and flood, across the years and decades and the century that came after, and the centuries that would come after that. The springs beneath it continued to run, keeping the center thin in winter, marking the invisible boundary between what a person could trust and what would fail them if they trusted it. The people who lived near it continued to know. That is how it was. That is how it remained. What Yiska did not tell the children in the first year, and did not tell anyone for some time, was the specific quality of the silence after the ice gave way. He had told the events in order and with accuracy, but there was a quality to certain moments that words could not carry, without the listener having experienced something adjacent to them, and that quality was in the silence that followed the sound of the ice and the voices, and then the diminishing of both. He had lain between the rocks on the ridge, and the silence had come in, and it was a different silence from the silence of the winter forest that had surrounded him before. It was a silence that had a shape to it, a specific shape, the shape of an absence that had not been there before, and was now permanent. He had known immediately what the silence meant. He had not needed to go down to the shore to confirm it. The silence told him. He had closed his eyes, and the silence had been loud, in a way that only certain kinds of silence are loud, filling the space that sound had occupied a moment before with something that was heavier than sound. He had lain between the rocks for a very long time. When he finally rose and turned east and began walking, the silence came with him for a while. It was not a comfortable companion. It was not an uncomfortable one either, in any simple way. It was simply present, the way things are present, that have become part of your experience, without your having chosen them, that have attached themselves to you in a moment of extremity, and have no intention of detaching. He had carried the silence with him, through the 12 days east, and into the camp, and through the first winter, and into the second year. It had diminished, not because it went away, but because other things grew around it. The way other things grow around a fixed point in a landscape, filling in the space, becoming more prominent than the fixed thing, even if the fixed thing does not itself change. The silence was still there. He had simply grown a life around it that was larger than it was. This was not the same as forgetting. He was specific about this distinction, when he eventually talked about it, to Clara, and to the old man. Forgetting was not something he wanted. The silence was part of what had happened, and what had happened was the foundation of who he had become, and what he was teaching, and why it mattered. If you forgot the silence, you forgot why the knowledge was worth passing on. You turned the story into an adventure story, a clever trick story, and lost the weight of it. The weight was the point. He had thought about this often in the years since, about the relationship between weight and meaning, about how the things that mattered most were often the things that cost something in the carrying of them. His grandfather's knowledge had cost his grandfather something in the acquiring of it: time, attention, the willingness to listen and to sit with what he heard, and to take it seriously enough to pass on. The year of solitude had cost Yiska considerably more than that, had cost him things that he could not fully account for even now. The crossing of the lake had cost the specific 4 men, and the dogs and the supplies on the sled. He was not the kind of person who could think about cost without thinking about all the parts of it. He was not interested in telling a story that had only one kind of weight in it, the weight of the person who survived. He was alive, that was real. He was grateful for it every day, in a way that he had not been grateful before, in the years before the spring, when life was ordinary, and did not require active gratitude, because it was simply there. But the gratitude was complicated. The things that had allowed him to survive had not been simple things, and the world that existed after them was not the same world that had existed before them, and a person who was not willing to hold all of that was a person who was managing their comfort rather than living with what was true. He lived with what was true. That was harder, and also better. He taught it to the children the only way such things can be taught, which was not directly, but through the quality of the telling, through the way he held the story when he told it, the weight of it visible in his voice and his manner, the respect he paid to every part of it, including the parts that were not comfortable. Children learned from the way a thing was told, as much as from what was said, and he was always conscious of this, always conscious that he was modeling not just the content of the story, but the relationship you should have with the content of a true story, which was a relationship of full honesty and full respect and willingness to carry the weight. William had learned this. He had seen it in William's telling of the story to the younger children, years later, when William was old enough to take on the role of evening storyteller, while Yiska rested his voice or was busy with something else. William told it with the same quality that Yiska had worked to put into it, the same full weight, the same respect for every part, and Yiska had sat in the back and listened, and felt the particular satisfaction of something transmitted correctly. He thought about his grandfather listening to the stories from the back of the fire circle, at an age when telling them had gone to the next generation. He thought about what that felt like from the inside. He thought he was beginning to understand. There was a morning in his 4th winter at the camp, when he woke before dawn and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of sleeping people, and the fire settling, and the wind very faint outside, and felt something that he identified after a moment as contentment. Not happiness exactly, not the absence of weight, not anything simple, but a satisfaction with the shape of his life, with the specific life he was living, in this specific place, with these specific people, and this specific work. He had lived more than half his life by then in the country of his birth, and more than a third of it in this camp under the flat-topped hill, and the two halves of his life were not separate things. They were continuous, joined by the year of solitude and the lake and the 12 days east, the way a river is continuous through the different landscapes it passes through, changing but always itself. He was always himself. That was the thing he had worried about, in the worst of the months alone. He had worried that the sustained difficulty would change him in ways that were not recoverable, that it would take from him something essential, and replace it with something harder, and less useful, and less himself. He had worried about the specific texture of his own character surviving intact, about whether he would come out the other end of that year as someone he recognized. He had come out recognizable. The year had added things and taken things, but had not taken the things that mattered, had not taken the curiosity or the patience or the habit of noticing, or the love of the stories, or the particular warmth he felt toward children when they were listening seriously to something that deserved their serious attention. These things had survived the year, and had survived the lake, and had survived the long walk east, and had survived, and were still present, on the morning he lay in the dark, and felt something he identified as contentment. He got up and put wood on the fire. He started the morning. There was work to do, and he was glad to do it, and outside the camp the winter was present, and serious, and beautiful in the way it always was at these temperatures, when the air was clear, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and the birds were not yet awake, but would be soon. And somewhere under the ice of the lake to the west, the springs were running as they had always run, as they would run for as long as the landscape held its shape. He thought, my grandfather told me about those springs, and I am alive. He thought, I told William about those springs, and William will tell his children, and the springs will keep running, long after all of us are gone, and somewhere in the future, there may be another person who needs to know about them, and they will know, because it was told and kept and told again. He thought, that is the work, that is all the work. Keep telling the true things, pass them on, trust that they will find the person who needs them. He went about the morning. The spring that came after the winter of Yiska's 50th year was the kind of spring that people talked about for a long time afterward, the kind that arrived decisively and early, and brought warmth that felt almost excessive after the cold that had preceded it. The rivers ran high. The migratory birds came back in numbers that the older people said they had not seen in decades. The south-facing slopes above the camp were green by the 3rd week of April, a full 2 weeks earlier than usual. Yiska walked to the top of the ridge above the camp that April, and stood looking at the landscape below, green and brown, and the last blue-white of snow on the north-facing slopes, and felt the warmth on his face, that was real warmth, not the thin warmth of January sun, but the full warmth of a season that was in earnest. Clara came up the ridge behind him. She did not say anything when she arrived. She stood beside him and looked at the same landscape he was looking at, and they stood there together for a while, with the view between them. He said, "I think I am going to write it down." She turned to look at him. He had been thinking about this for some time. He had the language of the outsiders well enough now, acquired over the years from George and other traders, and a teacher who had passed through the camp for several months years ago, and had been persuaded to teach in exchange for food and shelter, and the pleasure of the company. He could read and write in that language with moderate competence, enough to be clear if not elegant. He had been using it for practical things, notes about the trading accounts, letters that went east with George and came back with replies. He had not used it for anything like this. He said, "I want to write down the route, the landmarks, the ice knowledge, the springs, not just for the people here, not just in our languages, but in the other language, so that it can go further than my voice can carry it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The part about the springs?" He said, "Especially that part." She said, "Who will read it?" He said, "I do not know. Whoever needs it. Whoever is in a position somewhere ahead in time where it matters. I cannot know who that is. I can only make sure the knowledge is available to be found." She thought about this in her careful way. Then she said, "Your grandfather did not write it down." He said, "No, he did not need to. He had a grandson who was paying attention and who carried it forward. I have William and Edward and the children. But William and Edward and the children will have their own lives, and I do not know all the directions those lives will go, and the knowledge should not only exist in the people I can see and teach. It should also exist in a form that can travel without any of us." She nodded slowly. She said, "Then write it down." He wrote it down. He wrote it over several evenings through that spring and into the summer, working by firelight on the paper that George had brought at his request, writing in the careful, slightly formal way of someone who has learned a language from outside and knows it well enough to be accurate, but not well enough to be casual. He wrote the route east, landmark by landmark, the way his mother had described it, and the way he had added to it on the 12-day walk. He wrote the ice knowledge, the springs, the signs to read on a frozen lake that told you whether to trust the surface. He wrote a description of the lake itself, and where it was, and why it mattered. He did not write it as a story about himself. He wrote it as a guide, the way a person writes knowledge they want someone else to be able to use. He wrote it in the voice of someone who has found something true and wants to pass it on without making it about the finder. He gave the papers to George on his next visit, with instructions about where they should go. George read them. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You trust these words to travel?" Yiska said, "I trust them to try." George took the papers east. Where they went from there, Yiska was not entirely sure. He knew George had given them to someone in the Eastern Trading Network who had connections to people who collected such things, who were interested in preserving the knowledge of the Northern Territories. He received no reply that first year. In the second year, a message came back through George that the papers had been received and copied, and that copies had gone to 2 different places, one to the east and one to the south. He did not know what would happen to the copies. He accepted that he could not know, and that accepting this was part of what it meant to give knowledge away. He had done what he could. He kept teaching. He kept telling the stories in the evenings. He kept passing the knowledge to William and Edward and the children, person to person, voice to voice, the old way, the way that had worked for longer than writing had existed, and would work as long as there were people who understood the relationship between a speaker and a listener as a sacred one, as a transaction in which something real was being transferred from one person to another, and it was the responsibility of both people to take it seriously. He thought sometimes about all the knowledge that had not survived, the things that had been in people who were gone, in communities that no longer existed, in languages that no one spoke anymore, the things that had been in his own community, the specific knowledge of that specific territory, the names of the hills and the routes between them, and the habits of the animals, and the stories that explained where they had come from and who they were. Some of that knowledge was in him and would go forward through him. Some of it was gone, simply gone, finished, no longer available in the world. That was a loss of a kind that he had learned to sit with without letting it become the thing that defined his forward direction. The loss was real, and the loss mattered, and he held the weight of it. And he also got up in the morning and taught what he knew to the people who were listening. Both things were true at the same time. He was very good at holding two true things at the same time now, which was one of the things the year of solitude had given him, unwanted and essential, the ability to keep going while carrying weight, to be both bereaved and productive, both diminished and useful, both someone from whom things had been taken and someone who still had things to give. He gave them. He kept giving them. That was his life. It was a good life. George died in the winter of Yiska's 53rd year. Not in the camp, but on the trail between communities, the way traders sometimes died when the weather turned against them, and the shelter ran out. The news came in the spring, with a trader from the east, who had known George for many years, and who delivered the news with the careful economy of a person who has had to deliver this kind of news before, and understands that the thing to do is to say it clearly, without embellishment. Yiska sat with the news for a day before he said anything about it to anyone. He had known George for more than 5 years by then, and in those 5 years, George had been present in the camp perhaps 40 or 50 days in total, never more than a few days at a time, always moving in and out with the restless purposefulness of someone whose life was the motion between places rather than the time spent in them. And yet Yiska had known him in a way that went deeper than the total of those days, because the quality of attention that George brought to his brief visits was of the concentrated kind that builds relationships faster than ordinary time does. George had been the first person outside the camp to carry Yiska's story. He had been the link in the chain that had taken the account of the wolf tracks and the lake and pushed it into the larger network of knowledge that moved through the trading connections of the territory. He had been the person who took the written papers east. He had been reliable in the way that a mountain is reliable, not because it is always present, but because it is always in the same place when you need it, and you could orient by it. He thought about George's death in the way he thought about all the specific losses the years had brought, which was directly and without flinching, and with the full acknowledgement of what the loss was and what it meant. He did not soften it or find consolation too quickly. He let it be what it was for a day, the specific weight of a specific person being gone, and then he got up and continued. Clara had watched him during the day of the news. She had said nothing. She had simply been near him in the way that she was near him when something difficult was happening, available without being intrusive, present without demanding anything of his presence. He was grateful for this, in a way that was by now so old and deep that it had become part of the structure of his daily life, rather than something he noticed separately, the way a person stops noticing a mountain after enough years of living with it in view. He said to her that evening, he took things forward. He said, "Some people move things forward in the world, carry things from where they start to where they need to go, and when those people are gone, the things they were carrying still exist, still, wherever they were delivered, but the motion stops. I will miss the motion." Clara said, "He was a good carrier." Yiska said, "Yes." They sat with the fire between them. He thought about all the carriers, his grandfather, his mother, George, the elder whose grandfather had known the lake, the people who had listened to the stories in the evenings and held them and told them to others, the unnamed person in the Eastern Trading Network who had copied his written papers and sent the copies south, the community that had taken him in when he came out of the wilderness, that had given him the conditions to recover and to begin again, all of them carrying something forward. All of them part of a system of transmission that was larger than any one of them, that had been running longer than any of them had been alive, that would continue running longer than any of them would be alive, moving knowledge and stories and the specific true things about specific places through time, from the people who knew them to the people who would need to know them. He was part of that system. He had always been part of it, from the first evening his grandfather sat him down and began to talk. He would be part of it until the last evening story he told before his voice stopped. He was at peace with this. The fire crackled and settled. Outside, the spring was in the air even at night now, the cold retreating to the mornings, the afternoons genuinely warm in the sun. The river was up. The birds were noisy in the willows along the bank. Everything that had been compressed through the long winter was beginning to extend itself again, the way things always did, the way things had always done, season after season without exception, continuing. William came in late that evening, having been out checking the fish lines, and sat near the fire and said nothing for a while. He looked at Yiska with the quiet attention that had characterized him since he was a boy. He said, "Are you all right?" Yiska said, "Yes." He meant it, and William knew he meant it, because they had known each other long enough that meaning was communicable even in simple answers. William nodded. He poured himself something hot from the pot near the fire and sat with it. After a while he said, "I have been thinking about the lake." Yiska looked at him. William said, "Not what happened there. The lake itself." "What it is," he said. "I want to go and see it." He said it the way he said things he had thought about carefully, not as a request exactly, more as an announcement of a conclusion he had reached. He said, "I want to know it directly, not just from the telling." Yiska understood this. He had gone back to the lake himself, years ago, for exactly this reason. He said, "When?" William said, "This summer. When the traveling is easier." Yiska said, "I will come with you." William looked at him. He said, "You do not have to." Yiska said, "I know. I want to. There are things that are better seen together the first time." William accepted this. They went in July, the two of them, walking west through the summer landscape that was so different from the winter landscape that they moved through the same geography, as though it were a different country. The trees were full and green, and the ground was soft, and the birds were in full voice, and the light lasted until late in the evening, in the way that summer light at these latitudes lasted, as though the sky was reluctant to let it go. They reached the lake in 4 days. William stood at the shore and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Yiska stood beside him and also looked. The lake was beautiful in summer, deeply blue in the center where it was deepest, shallower green near the banks, clear enough in the shallows to see the bottom. A pair of loons were out in the center, calling across the water, their voices carrying the particular wild sadness of loon calls in summer, which was not actually sadness but sounded it, the way some beautiful things sound like something else. William said, "It does not look dangerous." Yiska said, "No, in summer it does not. The danger is specific to winter, to the ice, to the way the springs keep the center from freezing the same way the rest of it freezes. In summer the springs are just springs. They feed the lake the way springs always feed lakes. The danger is in the season when the surface hides what is underneath." William said, "The danger is in the hiding." Yiska said, "Yes. The danger is in what you cannot see, in the difference between what the surface shows and what is actually below. And the safety, the way out, is in knowing what is there when you cannot see it, in carrying the knowledge of the invisible thing." William thought about this. He said, "My children will know this lake." Yiska said, "Yes." William said, "And their children?" Yiska said, "Yes, that is the plan." They stood at the shore of the lake for a while in the July afternoon, with the loons calling and the water moving slightly at the bank, and Yiska thought about his grandfather, who had stood at this shore too, or at a shore very like it, at an age not unlike the age Yiska was now, telling his grandson about the springs. The circle. Not a complete circle, not a closed thing, but a spiral, going forward through time, each loop not quite meeting the previous one, carrying something from one point to the next. The thing carried changing slightly in each transit, losing some and gaining some, but remaining essentially itself through the changes, remaining the true thing about the lake that kept people alive. He was tired in a good way from the walk. The summer sun was warm on his back. The loons were talking to each other about something that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the lake and its fish, and their own loon lives, which were proceeding exactly as loon lives had always proceeded, indifferent to the history of the place in all the right ways. He put his hand on William's shoulder for a moment, briefly, and then took it away. They would head back in the morning. There were stories to tell. There were children waiting to listen. There was always that. There would always be that.